The Mirror of the Mind, a novel of critical thinking and self-discovery. Prologue, The Weight of Assumptions. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Meridian Consulting's 42nd floor, each droplet catching the amber glow of Copenhagen's evening lights. Elena Reeves stood motionless before the glass, her reflection a ghostly outline against the storm-darkened sky. The city below pulsed with life, cyclists braving the weather, trams gliding through narrow streets, people hurrying home to warmth and certainty. Certainty. The word felt foreign now, like a language she'd once spoken fluently but had somehow forgotten. Elena? She turned to find Marcus Chen standing in the doorway of the conference room, his usually pristine shirt wrinkled, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. The presentation slide still glowed on the massive screen behind him, frozen on the final recommendation slide that had just cost him the biggest client in the firm's history. "They're gone," he said unnecessarily. The silence that followed Ingmar Nordstrom's quiet, "We'll be taking our business elsewhere," still echoed in Elena's ears. "I know." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. 2 years of work. Gone. Marcus walked over to join her at the window, his reflection appearing beside hers in the glass. "What happened in there, Elena? That wasn't like you. The logic gaps, the unsupported assumptions. I know what happened." She pressed her palm against the cool glass. "I stopped thinking." It was a brutal admission, but Elena had built her career on brutal honesty. At 34, she was the youngest partner in Meridian's history, known throughout Scandinavia for her razor-sharp analysis and ability to see through the fog of corporate groupthink. Her clients didn't hire Elena Reeves for comfort. They hired her for clarity. But clarity had abandoned her somewhere along the way. "The pharmaceutical merger recommendation," Marcus continued, his voice gentle but probing. "You presented it as if it were inevitable, but you never actually proved it was the right choice. The cost-benefit analysis was incomplete. The risk assessment was." Surface level. "I know." Elena turned from the window, finally facing the wreckage of the evening. The conference table was still littered with the detritus of their failed presentation. Coffee cups, crumpled notes, and the leather portfolio that Nordstrom had snapped shut with finality. But why? Marcus had known Elena for 8 years, had watched her dismantle complex problems with the precision of a master surgeon. "This isn't you, Elena. You've always been the one who questioned everything, who dug deeper when everyone else was satisfied with the obvious answer." Elena walked to the head of the conference table and sank into her chair. The weight of the question, and her inability to answer it, pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. "I don't know," she whispered. "I used to see patterns everywhere, connections that others missed. I could spot a flawed assumption from across a room. But lately," she gestured helplessly at the failed presentation. "Lately, I feel like I'm sleepwalking through my own expertise." The admission hung in the air between them. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, the rain shifting from a furious drumming to a gentler percussion against the glass. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed Elena the screen. "I got a text from Astrid during the presentation. She's been watching the quarterly reviews, and our critical thinking scores are down across the entire Nordic division. Not just us, everyone." Elena frowned. Meridian tracked dozens of performance metrics, but critical thinking assessments were relatively new, introduced just 6 months ago by the global leadership team. She'd initially dismissed them as corporate theater, another box to check in the endless march of professional development. How far down? 23% in 6 months. The number hit Elena like cold water. A 23% decline in critical thinking wasn't just a statistical blip. It was an organizational crisis waiting to happen. How many other presentations had failed? How many flawed recommendations had been accepted simply because they sounded reasonable? "There's something else," Marcus said, his voice dropping. Astrid mentioned a program, something the London office has been piloting. Apparently, they've not only stopped the decline, but actually improved their scores by 40%. "What kind of program?" She was vague, called it cognitive recalibration, or something like that. "But Elena," Marcus leaned forward in his chair. "What if tonight wasn't just a failure? What if it was a wake-up call? Elena stared at her reflection in the polished surface of the conference table. The woman looking back at her was successful by every external measure, respected, well-compensated, influential. But success built on unconscious thinking was just elaborate scaffolding around an empty building. "I built my career on being the person who saw clearly when others were blind," she said finally. "I was the one who questioned assumptions, who dug beneath surface explanations. But somewhere along the way, I became the assumption." The insight surprised her with its clarity. She'd become so comfortable with her reputation as a critical thinker that she'd stopped actually thinking critically. Her expertise had become a cognitive shortcut, a way to avoid the hard work of genuine analysis. "So, what do we do?" Marcus asked. Elena stood and walked back to the window. The storm was passing, leaving behind a crystalline clarity in the air. The city light seemed sharper now, more defined. In the distance, she could see the spires of the old city, ancient buildings that had stood for centuries precisely because their builders had thought carefully about every stone, every angle, every decision. "We learn," she said. "We strip everything down and rebuild from the foundation up. We stop assuming we know how to think and actually learn how to think." She turned back to Marcus, and for the first time in months, felt a familiar stirring of intellectual curiosity that had once driven her relentlessly forward. "Contact Astrid. I want to know everything about this London program. And Marcus," she gathered her things with sudden purpose, "clear my calendar for the next 2 weeks. I have some fundamental questions to ask myself, and I suspect the answers are going to change everything." As they left the conference room together, Elena caught one last glimpse of their reflection in the darkened window. Two professionals humbled by the recognition that expertise without self-awareness was just elaborate ignorance. The real work was about to begin. Outside, Copenhagen glittered in the aftermath of the storm, ancient and modern intertwined, each building a testament to the enduring power of careful thought. Elena pulled her coat tight against the cool air and stepped into the night, carrying with her the uncomfortable but essential realization that the most important mirror she'd ever looked into wasn't made of glass. It was made of her own willingness to question everything she thought she knew about thinking itself. The journey back to clarity would begin tomorrow, but the recognition that such a journey was necessary had begun tonight, in the space between assumption and understanding, between confidence and wisdom. And for the first time in months, Elena Reeves felt genuinely awake. Chapter 1, The Hidden Blueprint. The morning after the Nordstrom disaster, Elena arrived at Meridian's offices before dawn. The building's lobby was a cathedral of glass and steel, its minimalist design radiating the quiet confidence that had once defined Elena herself. Now, walking across the polished marble floor toward the elevators, she felt like an imposter in her own life. The 42nd floor was tomb quiet at this hour. Elena's corner office looked out over the Øresund Strait, where early morning ferries traced white lines across dark water toward Sweden. She'd always loved this view, the sense of movement and purpose, of connection between distant shores. Today, it felt like a mockery of her own stagnation. She opened her laptop and pulled up the encrypted message that had arrived overnight from Astrid Larsen, Meridian's Nordic Division Director. The subject line read simply, "London Protocol Confidential. Elena, following our conversation with Marcus, I've arranged a call with Dr. James Whitmore, who developed a cognitive recalibration program in our London office. The results speak for themselves. Not only have they reversed a decline in critical thinking scores, but their client retention has improved by 37%, and their problem-solving efficiency has nearly doubled. The program isn't what you might expect. It's not corporate training or motivational workshops. According to James, it's more like cognitive archaeology, excavating the hidden assumptions and automatic thought patterns that prevent us from seeing clearly. He can speak with you this morning at 9 a.m. Copenhagen time. I've taken the liberty of clearing your calendar. One more thing. Elena, James mentioned that the most successful participants in the program were those who had the furthest to fall. The higher the tower of assumed expertise, he said, the more dramatic the reconstruction. I suspect you'll find the conversation illuminating. Astrid, Elena stared at the message. Cognitive archaeology. The phrase resonated with something deep in her chest, a recognition she couldn't quite name. She'd spent years building her professional identity around her ability to think clearly, but when was the last time she'd actually examined the foundations of that thinking? At exactly 9 o'clock, her phone rang. Elena Reeves. Dr. Whitmore here. Astrid tells me you've experienced what we call a clarity crisis. The voice was warm, with the refined accent of educated London, but there was something else in it. A quality of attention that made Elena feel immediately seen. That's one way to put it, Elena said, settling into her chair. I lost a major client because my analysis was, let's say, incomplete. And you're wondering how someone with your reputation for critical thinking could suddenly become so uncritical in your thinking. The observation stung because it was accurate. Something like that. Elena, may I ask you a question that might sound impertinent? Go ahead. When did you last change your mind about something fundamental? Not a minor opinion or preference, but a core belief about how the world works. Elena opened her mouth to respond, then paused. The question hung in the air like a challenge. She scrolled mentally through the past months, the past year, searching for a moment of genuine intellectual surprise, a time when new evidence had genuinely shifted her worldview. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. That's a harder question than it should be, she admitted finally. Indeed, and that, my dear, is the heart of your predicament. You become so skilled at thinking that you've stopped learning to think. Your expertise has calcified into assumption. Elena felt a flutter of defensiveness. I analyze complex problems for a living. I question assumptions constantly. Do you? Or do you question other people's assumptions while leaving your own unexamined? Dr. Whitmore's voice remained gentle, but the question cut deep. Tell me about yesterday's presentation. What was your foundational assumption? That the pharmaceutical merger would create synergies and reduce costs? No, deeper than that. What did you assume about the nature of the problem itself? Elena frowned, replaying the presentation in her mind. She'd approached the client situation as a straightforward efficiency challenge, analyzing cost structures and market positions. But now, forced to examine her own thinking process, she realized she'd never questioned whether efficiency was actually what Nordstrom Industries needed. I assumed, she said slowly, that their problem was operational rather than strategic. I assumed they wanted to optimize their current approach rather than fundamentally rethink it. Precisely. And that assumption shaped every analysis that followed. You solved the wrong problem brilliantly, which is often worse than solving the right problem poorly. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd spent 2 years building an elegant solution to a question no one had actually asked. But how does this happen? Elena asked, how does someone trained in critical analysis become so unconscious? Now you're asking the right question. Elena, have you heard of the phenomenon called expert's mind? Vaguely. It's the curse of mastery. The more expert we become in our field, the more our brains create shortcuts, heuristics that allow us to process information quickly and efficiently. These shortcuts are tremendously useful, but they come with a hidden cost. We begin to see patterns that aren't there, to apply solutions that worked in the past to problems that are fundamentally different. Elena walked to her window, phone pressed to her ear. Below, the morning commute was beginning. Streams of people moving with purpose across the city. Each person carrying their own invisible assumptions, their own unexamined beliefs about how the world worked. So what's the solution? She asked. That's where it gets interesting. The solution isn't to abandon expertise. That would be throwing away years of valuable learning. Instead, we need to develop what I call metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe our own thinking processes in real time. Like becoming a witness to your own mind? Exactly. Most people are so immersed in their thoughts that they can't distinguish between their thinking and reality itself. They don't realize that their interpretation of events is just that, an interpretation, not truth. Elena found herself nodding. I felt something like that yesterday. There was a moment when I realized I wasn't seeing the client's actual problem. I was seeing my mental model of their problem. Brilliant. That moment of recognition is what we call cognitive awakening. It's the first step in reclaiming genuine critical thinking. Dr. Whitmore paused, and Elena could hear papers rustling in the background. "Elena, I'd like to propose something. We have a 10-day intensive program starting next Monday. It's not traditional corporate training. It's more like a cognitive laboratory where participants learn to examine their own thinking processes." 10 days seems like a long time. How long did it take you to build the assumptions that led to yesterday's failure? The question stopped Elena cold. Years. It had taken years of success, praise, and professional reinforcement to build the elaborate structure of unexamined beliefs that had finally collapsed in front of Ingmar Nordstrom. The program takes place at Thornfield Institute, about an hour outside London. It's residential, which is essential because the real work happens in the spaces between formal sessions. In reflection, in conversation, in the gradual recognition of patterns you've been blind to. Elena looked around her office, the award on the walls, the leather-bound books, the carefully curated symbols of expertise. All of it felt suddenly hollow, like a museum exhibit of someone she used to be. What exactly would I be learning? How to question your own questions. How to recognize the emotional filters that color your perceptions. How to distinguish between what you know and what you think you know. Most importantly, you'll learn to embrace what we call productive uncertainty, the willingness to sit with not knowing long enough for genuine insight to emerge. The phrase resonated with Elena in a way she didn't fully understand. Productive uncertainty. Her entire career had been built on providing certainty to clients, on having answers. But what if the quality of her answers was only as good as the quality of her questions? "There's something else," Dr. Whitmore continued. "The program isn't just individual work. You'll be working with a cohort, other professionals who've recognized that their expertise has become their limitation. There's something powerful about seeing your own blind spots reflected in other struggles." Elena thought about Marcus's observation the night before, about the organization-wide decline in critical thinking. Maybe her crisis wasn't personal. Maybe it was systemic, a collective loss of intellectual humility in favor of confident certainty. "Can I ask about the other participants?" This cohort includes a surgeon who's been making diagnostic assumptions based on pattern recognition rather than evidence, a tech executive whose innovation pipeline dried up because he stopped questioning his industry's fundamental assumptions, and a financial analyst who's been seeing market patterns that exist more in her expectations than in reality. Each description felt like a mirror reflecting different aspects of Elena's own situation. The surgeon trusting patterns over evidence, the executive trapped in industry orthodoxy, the analyst seeing what she expected to see rather than what was actually there. What makes you think this approach works? Because it's based on a simple recognition. The problems we face today aren't caused by a lack of information or analytical techniques. They're caused by invisible assumptions that prevent us from seeing the information clearly. Most professional development focuses on adding new tools to your toolkit. We focus on examining the lens through which you see the world. Elena walked back to her desk and opened her calendar. The next 2 weeks were packed with meetings, presentations, client calls, the busy work of maintaining her professional momentum. But momentum toward what? More elegant solutions to unquestioned problems? "I need to discuss this with my team," she said finally. "Of course. But Elena, let me leave you with one thought. Every day you postpone questioning your assumptions is another day those assumptions shape your reality without your permission. The cost of 10 days of discomfort is nothing compared to the cost of years of unconscious certainty." After the call ended, Elena sat in the silence of her office, watching the morning light shift across Copenhagen's rooftops. Dr. Whitmore's words echoed in her mind. "Your expertise is calcified into assumption." She opened a new document on her laptop and began typing. Questions for self-examination. 1. What fundamental assumptions am I making about my client's problems? 2. When did I last change my mind about something important? 3. What patterns do I see that might not actually be there? 4. What am I certain about that I have never actually questioned? Each question felt like a small act of rebellion against the comfortable certainty that had defined her professional identity. But as uncomfortable as the questions were, the alternative, remaining trapped in unconscious patterns until the next inevitable failure, felt unbearable. Elena's reflection was interrupted by a soft knock on her door. Marcus entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the careful expression of someone bearing difficult news. "I've been analyzing our client portfolio from the past year," he said, setting a cup on Elena's desk, looking for patterns in our wins and losses. Elena accepted the coffee gratefully. "What did you find?" Marcus pulled up a chair and opened his tablet. "Our success rate has been declining gradually over the past 18 months, but so subtly that we attributed it to market conditions or increased competition. But when I looked at the root causes," he turned the screen toward Elena. "The data was sobering. Client losses clustered around specific types of errors, solutions that address symptoms rather than root causes, recommendations that reflected industry conventional wisdom rather than genuine analysis, strategies that worked in theory but ignored contextual realities. We've been solving the wrong problems," Elena murmured, Dr. Whitmore's words echoing in her mind. "It's worse than that," Marcus said. "We've been so confident in our approach that we stopped seeking disconfirming evidence. Every successful project reinforced our belief that we were thinking clearly, but we weren't tracking the projects that succeeded despite our recommendations or the problems that remained unsolved." Elena stared at the data, seeing her own cognitive crisis reflected in organizational patterns. "Marcus, how would you feel about a 10-day sabbatical?" She told him about Dr. Whitmore's program, watching his expression shift from skepticism to curiosity to something approaching relief. "You know what's strange?" he said when she finished. "Yesterday felt like a disaster, but this morning, for the first time in months, I feel genuinely excited about learning something new." Elena nodded. The crisis had cracked open something she hadn't realized was closed. Her willingness to be wrong, to not know, to sit in the discomfort of uncertainty until genuine understanding emerged. "There's just one thing," Marcus added. "If we're going to do this, we need to be honest with the team about why, about what we recognize in ourselves." Elena considered this. Admitting intellectual failure to her colleagues felt professionally suicidal, but continuing to operate under false certainty felt spiritually suicidal. "You're right," she said. "If we're going to rebuild from the foundation up, we need to start with radical honesty about what we're rebuilding from." She reached for her phone to call Astrid, but paused. "Marcus, one more question. What if we're wrong about this too? What if this program is just another assumption, another shortcut disguised as wisdom?" Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile Elena had seen from him in weeks. "Then we'll learn to question that assumption too." "But Elena, the difference between this assumption and our old ones is that this one starts with admitting we might be wrong. That's not certainty disguised as humility. It's actual humility." Elena nodded and dialed Astrid's number. Outside her window, Copenhagen continued its daily rhythm, ancient and modern intertwined, each building a testament to the ongoing human project of learning to see more clearly. The conversation that followed would commit Elena to 10 days of productive uncertainty, of cognitive archaeology, of learning to question the questioner. But more than that, it would commit her to the most difficult challenge of all, learning to be genuinely curious about her own mind. As she spoke with Astrid about the program logistics, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The intellectual vertigo that comes with standing at the edge of genuine learning, ready to discover that everything you thought you knew was just the beginning of what you might understand. The real journey was about to begin. Chapter 2. The Observer and the Observed. The train from London's Paddington Station cut through the English countryside like a silver thread, carrying Elena deeper into territory, both geographical and psychological. Outside her window, rolling hills gave way to ancient forests, their autumn colors blazing against an overcast sky. She'd left Copenhagen that morning feeling like she was fleeing from her reputation, her assumptions, her comfortable certainties. Now, watching the landscape transform, she wondered if she was actually returning to something she'd lost. Thornfield Institute emerged from a grove of oak trees, like something from another century. The Georgian mansion had been converted into a residential learning center, its honey-colored stone walls and tall windows radiating the kind of intellectual gravitas that Elena associated with serious academic work. Ivy climbed the facade in artful disorder, and the circular drive was lined with late-blooming roses that seemed to glow despite the gray afternoon light. Dr. James Whitmore met her at the entrance, and Elena was surprised by how different he was from what she'd imagined. She'd expected someone older, more formally academic. Instead, she found a man perhaps 10 years her senior with salt and pepper hair, wearing jeans and a wool sweater that looked like it had seen decades of thoughtful wear. His eyes held the quality she'd noticed in his voice, a depth of attention that made her feel simultaneously comfortable and exposed. "Elena, welcome to Thornfield. How was your journey?" "Enlightening, actually. I spent the whole trip making lists of assumptions I want to examine, then realized that making lists might itself be an assumption about how learning works." Dr. Whitmore smiled. "Ah, you're already beginning to doubt your own methods. That's either very promising or very dangerous." Elena followed him to the mansion's entrance hall, where oil paintings of long-dead scholars gazed down from dark wood panels. The space felt alive with history and conversation. She could hear voices drifting from various rooms, the kind of animated discussion that happened when intelligent people were genuinely curious about something. "Before I introduce you to the others," Dr. Whitmore said, leading her up a curved staircase, "I want to show you something that might help frame what we're attempting here." They paused at a landing where a large mirror hung in an ornate frame. But this wasn't an ordinary mirror. Its surface was divided into sections, each reflecting at a slightly different angle, creating a fragmented view of whoever looked into it. "What do you see?" Dr. Whitmore asked. Elena studied her reflection, scattered across the various segments. "I see myself, but fractured, incomplete. Each section shows a different angle, a different aspect." "Precisely. This is a metaphor for how we typically understand ourselves and our thinking. We see fragments, our expertise in one area, our blind spots in another, our biases here, our insights there. But we rarely see the whole pattern, the way these fragments interact to create our complete perspective." Elena found herself leaning closer to the mirror, try to synthesize the scattered images into a coherent whole. So the goal is to see all the fragments at once. The goal is to step back far enough to see that you are not the fragments. You are the one looking at them. Most people spend their lives identified with their thoughts, their expertise, their mental patterns. They don't realize there's a deeper awareness that can observe all of it. The distinction resonated with something Elena had felt the previous week, that moment during the failed presentation, when she'd realized she was watching her own assumptions in action. She'd glimpsed the observer, the part of herself that could witness her own thinking without being trapped inside it. They continued up to the second floor, where Elena's room waited, a comfortable space with tall windows overlooking the Institute's gardens. The simplicity was striking after her usual luxury hotels. A single bed with white linens, a wooden desk, a chair positioned to catch the afternoon light. On the desk lay a leather journal and a simple note. "For questions without answers. We'll gather for dinner in an hour," Dr. Whitmore said. "It will give you a chance to meet your cohort and begin the process of seeing your own patterns reflected in others' experiences." After he left, Elena unpacked her single suitcase. 10 days' worth of casual clothes, a far cry from her usual business attire. She debated what to bring to a program that promised to strip away professional identity, finally settling on simplicity itself as a statement of openness to change. The journal on the desk drew her attention. She opened it to find the first page already inscribed with a quote. "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." Albert Einstein. Below that in Dr. Whitmore's handwriting. "But first, we must recognize what that thinking actually is." Elena sat at the desk and began to write. Day 1. Questions I'm afraid to ask. What if my entire career has been built on sophisticated pattern matching rather than genuine thinking? What if my confidence has been masking intellectual laziness? What if I don't actually know how to think critically? I just know how to appear as if I do. The questions felt dangerous, like small acts of professional suicide. But they also felt necessary, the way surgery feels necessary despite the pain it causes. At 6 o'clock, Elena made her way to the dining room, a warmly lit space with exposed beams and a large fireplace where logs crackled cheerfully. 3 other people were already seated at a round table, deep in conversation. They looked up as she entered, and she felt the particular tension that comes with meeting people who will witness your intellectual vulnerability. Dr. Whitmore rose from his chair. "Elena, let me introduce your cohort. Dr. Sarah Chun, He gestured to a woman about Elena's age with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of focused presence Elena associated with medical professionals. Sarah is a surgical oncologist from Singapore General Hospital. Sarah smiled and stood to shake Elena's hand. I've been looking forward to meeting you. James mentioned you're facing a similar challenge. Expertise has become a limitation rather than an asset. Dr. Andreas Mueller. Dr. Whitmore continued, indicating a tall man with prematurely gray hair and the slightly shell-shocked expression of someone whose worldview had recently been shattered. Andreas founded 3 successful tech companies before recognizing that his innovation methodology had calcified into orthodoxy. Andreas nodded ruefully. Turns out disrupting industries is easier than disrupting your own assumptions about disrupting industries. And Rachel Morrison, Dr. Whitmore concluded, gesturing to a woman with red hair and the kind of restless energy that suggested a mind always in motion. Rachel is a quantitative analyst who discovered that her pattern recognition skills were creating patterns where none existed. Rachel laughed, but there was no humor in it. I was seeing market signals in random noise and convincing myself it was insight. Nearly cost my firm $50 million before I realized the emperor had no clothes. Elena took her seat, feeling both relieved and unsettled by how familiar their struggles sounded. Each of them had reached the pinnacle of their profession only to discover that the peak was actually a plateau, a comfortable place where learning had stopped. Now, Dr. Whitmore said as a simple dinner was served, roasted chicken, seasonal vegetables, bread that smelled like it had been baked that afternoon. Before we dive into the formal work, I'd like each of you to share the moment when you first realized that your expertise might be limiting your vision. Elena, would you start? Elena had rehearsed various versions of this story during the train ride, but sitting here among people who had faced similar reckonings, she found herself speaking more honestly than she planned. I lost a major client because I spent 2 years solving the wrong problem brilliantly, she began, then described a Nordstrom presentation and its aftermath. But as she spoke, she realized a real moment of recognition had come earlier, not in the conference room, but in the weeks leading up to it, when she felt increasingly disconnected from her own analytical process. I used to feel this sense of intellectual excitement when tackling a complex problem, she said, like I was a detective following clues towards some hidden truth. But somewhere along the way, I stopped following clues and started following formulas. I was running on intellectual autopilot, applying previous solutions to new problems without really seeing what was actually in front of me. Sarah nodded knowingly. In surgery, we call that expertise bias. When you successfully diagnose a particular condition hundreds of times, your brain starts seeing that condition everywhere, even when the symptoms point to something completely different. What was your moment? Elena asked. Sarah set down her fork, her expression growing serious. I missed a rare tumor because I was so certain I was looking at the common variant that I didn't order the test that would have revealed the difference. The patient survived, but it was close. I realized I'd been seeing what I expected to see rather than what was actually there. Andreas leaned forward. For me, it was a startup I was advising. They came to me with what I immediately categorized as a scaling challenge, because that's the type of problem I'd solved successfully many times before. I prescribed my standard playbook: agile development, user-centered design, iterative growth. 6 months later, they were dead in the water. What had you missed? Dr. Whitmore asked. The market itself. I'd assumed they were in a scaling phase because that's where most of my successful companies had been when I met them. But they were actually in a discovery phase. They didn't even know if there was genuine demand for their product. All my scaling advice was like putting racing tires on a car that didn't have an engine. Rachel laughed bitterly. At least you were giving advice about real problems. I was finding correlation patterns in data that were essentially random fluctuations. I built an entire trading algorithm around what I thought was a predictive model, but it was really just sophisticated noise interpretation. What enabled you to see that? Elena asked. A new junior analyst asked me to explain the theoretical foundation for one of my key patterns. I realized I couldn't, not because the explanation was complex, but because there wasn't one. I'd been so impressed by the mathematical elegance of the pattern that I'd never questioned whether it represented anything meaningful. Dr. Whitmore had been listening quietly, but now he spoke. What you're all describing is the same phenomenon from different angles. You each reached a level of expertise where your competence became unconscious. You stopped seeing your thinking process as a process and started experiencing it as direct perception of reality. Elena frowned. But isn't that what expertise is supposed to be? The ability to recognize patterns quickly, to know the right answer without having to consciously work through every step. That's certainly how expertise is often described. Dr. Whitmore agreed. And in stable, well-understood domains, that kind of intuitive pattern recognition can be extremely valuable. The problem arises when we apply that same unconscious competence to novel situations that look similar to familiar ones, but are actually fundamentally different. He stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulling down a slim volume. There's a wonderful study by chess masters that illustrates this perfectly. When shown actual game positions from master-level play, they could recall the positions with stunning accuracy after just a brief glance. But when shown random arrangements of pieces on a chess board, positions that could never arise in actual play, their recall was no better than beginners. So their expertise was in recognizing meaningful patterns, not just memorizing piece positions, Andrea said. Exactly. But here's the crucial insight. In their domain, chess, it's relatively easy to distinguish between meaningful patterns and random arrangements. The rules are clear, the boundaries are defined. In the complex, ambiguous situations we face in business, medicine, or innovation, the distinction between meaningful patterns and random arrangements is much more difficult to discern. Elena felt something clicking into place. So we apply our pattern recognition skills to situations that feel familiar, but we're actually looking at random arrangements disguised as meaningful patterns. Or worse, Rachel added, we're so committed to seeing meaningful patterns that we impose them on random arrangements, the way I was doing with market data. Dr. Whitmore returned to his seat, which brings us to tonight's central question. If our expertise can mislead us and our pattern recognition can see patterns that aren't there, how do we learn a thing about thinking itself? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Elena realized this was what she'd been searching for without knowing it, not just better analytical techniques, but awareness of the analytical process itself, the ability to step back from her thinking and observe it, question it, redirect it. That's what we call metacognitive awareness, Dr. Whitmore continued. The capacity to observe your own cognitive processes as they happen. Most people are so immersed in their thoughts that they can't distinguish between their thinking and reality itself. They don't realize that every interpretation, every pattern recognition, every expert judgment is just that, an interpretation. Sarah leaned forward. So the goal is to develop what? A kind of internal observer? Someone who watches the expert making decisions and questions whether those decisions make sense. Something like that, though it's important to understand that this observer isn't another expert with better judgment. It's more like a curious scientist who's fascinated by the process of judgment itself, less concerned with being right than with understanding how rightness and wrongness emerge. Elena found herself thinking about the fragmented mirror Dr. Whitmore had shown her earlier, like learning to see your expertise as one fragment of a larger picture rather than the whole picture itself. Beautiful analogy, Dr. Whitmore said. Your expertise becomes a tool you can pick up and examine rather than an identity you're trapped inside. As dinner wound down, Dr. Whitmore outlined the structure of their 10 days together. Mornings would focus on recognizing cognitive patterns, the automatic ways our minds process information. Afternoons would involve practical exercises in applying newfound awareness to real problems. Evenings would be for reflection and integration. But the real work, he cautioned, happens in the spaces between formal sessions, in your private moments of recognition, in conversations with your cohort members, in the gradual realization that everything you thought you knew about knowing is just the beginning. Walking back to her room later, Elena felt a mixture of excitement and vertigo that reminded her of standing at the edge of a high cliff. She was about to jump into unfamiliar territory, leaving behind the solid ground of professional certainty for the open space of not knowing. But as uncomfortable as that felt, it also felt alive in a way she hadn't experienced in years. She was genuinely curious again, not about problems she could solve, but about questions she didn't yet know how to ask. In her journal that night, she wrote. What the most expert thing I can do is learn to doubt my own expertise. What if uncertainty isn't the enemy of knowledge, but its most essential partner? What if the real adventure isn't in having answers, but in discovering better questions? Outside her window, the countryside lay hidden in darkness, full of possibilities she couldn't yet see. Tomorrow, the real journey into the landscape of her own mind would begin. Elena closed a journal and settled into sleep, carried by the unfamiliar comfort of not knowing what she would discover about herself in the morning. For the first time in years, that uncertainty felt like freedom rather than failure. Chapter 3. The Emotional Filters. Elena woke before dawn to the sound of rain pattering against her windows. The English countryside lay shrouded in mist, barely visible in the gray pre-dawn light. She'd slept fitfully, her dreams populated by fragmented mirrors and endless corridors where every door opened onto the same room, a conference room where Ingmar Nordstrom sat waiting with that expression of quiet disappointment. The dining room was already occupied when Elena arrived for breakfast. Rachel sat by the window with a cup of coffee and a notepad, scribbling equations with the intense focus of someone trying to solve an unsolvable problem. Sarah was at the sideboard, methodically arranging her breakfast with a precision Elena recognized from her own morning rituals. The small ceremonies that created an illusion control in an uncertain world. Morning. Andreas called out from a corner table where he was reading what appeared to be a philosophical text. Sleep well. I dreamed I was giving the same failed presentation over and over, Elena admitted, pouring herself coffee from a thermos that promised to be stronger than anything she'd find in corporate Copenhagen. Each time, I was convinced I'd fixed the problems from the previous version, but it always ended the same way. Sarah looked up from her precisely arranged breakfast. Repetition dreams. I get those too. Usually I'm performing the same surgery repeatedly, each time certain I've corrected the error that led to complications, but the patient always crashes at the same moment. Fascinating, Rachel murmured without looking up from her equations. I dream about finding patterns in data that dissolve the moment I try to explain them to someone else. The pattern looks so clear until I have to articulate what it actually means. Dr. Whitmore entered the dining room carrying a steaming mug and wearing the kind of satisfied expression that suggested he'd been awake for hours, probably walking in the misty countryside while his students wrestled with their unconscious minds. I couldn't help overhearing, he said, settling into a chair with the easy grace of someone completely comfortable with not knowing what the day would bring. Tell me, what do you think your dreams are trying to show you? Elena considered the question while buttering a piece of toast that smelled like it had been baked in a centuries-old oven. Repetition? The way we get trapped in the same patterns, even when we think we're changing. Perhaps. Or maybe they're showing you something about the relationship between knowing and feeling. Sarah, in your surgery dreams, what emotion do you experience when the patient crashes? Sarah set down her coffee cup with the careful precision of someone used to controlling tremors. Shame. Deep, overwhelming shame. Not just professional embarrassment, but something more personal, like I've failed at my core identity. And Elena, when Nordstrom walks out in your dream, Elena closed her eyes, trying to recapture the emotional texture of the dream. Fear. But not fear of losing the client. Fear of being exposed as, I don't know, incompetent, a fraud. Rachel finally looked up from her equations. Confusion. But not about the data. Confusion about myself. Like I can't trust my own perception of reality. Dr. Whitmore nodded thoughtfully. What you're describing is what we call emotional scaffolding. The feelings that support and shape our thinking processes. Most people believe that rational analysis is separate from emotion, but neuroscience has shown us something quite different. He stood and walked to a whiteboard that had been wheeled into the dining room, picking up a marker with the unconscious ease of a natural teacher. Every thought is paired with an emotion, and every emotion colors our interpretation of information. When Elena approaches a client problem, she's not just analyzing data. She's managing the fear of being wrong. The desire to appear competent, the shame of not knowing, the excitement of solving something complex. Elena felt a flutter of recognition. So our emotions act like filters? Exactly. Like colored lenses that tint everything we see. If you're looking through the lens of fear, you'll see threats everywhere. If you're looking through the lens of shame, you'll see evidence of your inadequacy. If you're looking through the lens of pride, you'll see confirmation of your superiority. He drew a simple diagram on the whiteboard, a stick figure looking at an object with several different colored circles between them representing emotional filters. The tragedy is that we rarely notice these filters because they're so familiar. They feel like objective perception rather than subjective interpretation. Elena, when you were preparing the Nordstrom presentation, what emotional state were you in? Elena thought back to those long weeks of analysis and preparation. Confident, I suppose. I felt like I understood their business model, like I could see the obvious solution that they were missing. Confidence, Dr. Whitmore repeated, writing the word on the board. A positive emotion, right? What could go wrong with feeling confident? When confidence becomes certainty, Andrea said slowly, you stop looking for disconfirming evidence. Precisely. Elena's confidence filter made her see patterns that supported her initial hypothesis, while rendering her blind information that contradicted it. The emotion wasn't wrong. Confidence can fuel excellent work. But unconscious confidence becomes arrogance, and arrogance stops learning. Rachel closed her notepad. Is that what happened with my trading algorithm? I was so excited by the mathematical elegance of the patterns, I was finding that I never questioned whether they were meaningful. What do you think? Rachel was quiet for a long moment, her finger tracing patterns on the wooden table. Excitement made me see what I wanted to see. I was high on the feeling of discovery, and that high made me bypass basic skeptical questioning. Sarah leaned forward. In surgery, we talk about the dangers of both overconfidence and underconfidence. Overconfidence leads to hasty decisions and misdiagnoses. Underconfidence leads to paralysis and delayed treatment. But I never thought about how my emotional state was literally changing what I could perceive. This morning, Dr. Whitmore said, we're going to practice something called emotional labeling. It's a simple technique, but it can be transformative. The next time you notice yourself interpreting information or making a decision, pause and ask, what am I feeling right now? And how might that feeling be coloring what I see? He walked back to the whiteboard and wrote, this is fear versus I am afraid. The difference between these two statements is profound. I am afraid makes fear into an identity. It becomes who you are. This is fear makes it an experience you're observing. It creates space between you and the emotion, allowing you to see how the emotion might be influencing your thinking. Elena stared at the sentences, feeling something shift in her understanding. So instead of being trapped inside the emotional filter, you can step back and see the filter itself. Exactly. You become the observer of your own emotional landscape, rather than its victim. After breakfast, Dr. Whitmore led them to what he called the practice room, a circular space with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto the misty gardens. The room was furnished simply with cushions arranged in a circle, the kind of space that encouraged contemplation rather than performance. I want each of you to choose a professional decision you've made in the past year, ideally one that didn't turn out as well as you'd hoped. We're going to practice emotional archaeology, digging beneath the logical reasons of decision to explore what feelings might have influenced your thinking. Elena immediately thought of the Nordstrom presentation, but something made her pause. There was another decision, one she'd barely acknowledged as a decision at all. I'd like to work on something more subtle, she said. About 6 months ago, I was asked to lead a pro bono project for a refugee resettlement organization. I declined because I said we didn't have the bandwidth, but I'm starting to wonder if that was the real reason. Tell us about the request, Dr. Whitmore said. The organization needed help restructuring their volunteer coordination system. It wasn't complex work, probably 2 weeks of analysis and recommendations. We had the capacity, and it would have been good visibility for the firm. So, why did you decline? Elena closed her eyes, tried to recapture her state of mind from 6 months earlier. I remember feeling resistant, like the work was beneath our usual standards. We typically work with Fortune 500 companies, major governmental organizations. This felt small. What emotion is beneath resistance? Sarah asked gently. The question surprised Elena with its directness, but she appreciated Sarah's clinical approach to emotional excavation. I suppose superiority? Like my expertise was too valuable to waste on a small nonprofit. Go deeper, Dr. Whitmore encouraged. Superiority often masks other feelings. What might you have been protecting yourself from? Elena sat with the question, letting her mind drift back to that conversation with the nonprofit director, a young woman, probably Elena's age, who had spoken with such passionate clarity about the lives they were trying to rebuild. Elena remembered feeling something during that call, something she quickly pushed aside. Inadequacy, she said finally. The director knew so much more than I did about the real human cost of displacement, about what actually mattered in terms of helping people rebuild their lives. My analytical framework felt suddenly abstract and bloodless compared to her knowledge. Ah, Dr. Whitmore said softly. So the superiority was a defense against feeling like your expertise might be irrelevant to what really mattered. Elena nodded, surprised by the sudden sting of tears. I was afraid that if I worked with them, I'd realize that all my sophisticated analysis tools couldn't address the complexity of real human suffering. It was easier to dismiss the project as beneath my standards than confront the possibility that my standards might be beside the point. Rachel leaned forward. That's exactly what I do with simpler trading models. I dismiss them as unsophisticated, but really I'm afraid they might work better than my complex algorithms. The complexity protects me from having to face the possibility that I'm overcomplicating things. Andreas nodded vigorously, and I do it with established companies. I tell myself they're too set in their ways to embrace real innovation, but actually I'm afraid they might challenge my assumptions about what innovation looks like. What you're discovering, Dr. Whitmore said, is that emotions don't just color our perceptions. They actively shape our choices about what we're willing to perceive. Elena's fear of inadequacy made her avoid a situation that might have revealed the limitations of her analytical approach. But that's exactly the kind of situation I should have sought out, Elena realized. If I want to understand the boundaries of my expertise, I need to find places where it doesn't work. That's beautiful insight. But notice what just happened. You immediately moved into problem-solving mode. I should have sought out challenges to my expertise. Can you feel the emotional energy beneath that thought? Elena paused, turning her attention inward. Excitement and maybe redemption? Like I can fix my previous mistake by making a better choice next time. Yes, and excitement and the desire for redemption are also emotional filters. They might lead you to seek out challenges not because they're genuinely valuable, but because overcoming them would make you feel competent again. The insight hit Elena like cold water. Even her recognition of emotional filters was being filtered through emotion. So how do you ever get to clear seeing? If every thought is paired with an emotion, and every emotion color perception, how do you find objective truth? Dr. Whitmore smiled. That's the wrong question. Elena felt a flash of irritation. What do you mean? You're still looking for a way to escape subjectivity, to find some Olympian viewpoint where you can see reality without the contamination of feeling. But what if subjectivity isn't contamination? What if the goal isn't to eliminate emotional filters, but to be aware of them? Sarah spoke up. In medicine, we don't try to eliminate the possibility of diagnostic error. That's impossible. We try to build in systems for recognizing and correcting errors when they occur. Exactly, Dr. Whitmore said. The goal isn't to achieve perfect objectivity. It's to develop what we might call emotional transparency, the ability to see your own filters clearly enough that you can account for them in your analysis. He walked to the center of their circle. Let's try an exercise. Elena, I want you to think about the refugee organization again. But this time, instead of trying to figure out the right response, I want you to practice emotional labeling. Tell us what you're feeling as you think about potentially working with them now. Elena closed her eyes and brought the organization back to mind. I'm feeling guilt about declining the first time, excitement about the possibility of applying my skills to something meaningful, anxiety about whether I'm really good enough to help them effectively. Good. Can you feel how each of those emotions might shape your thinking about whether to reach out to them? The guilt makes me want to overcommit, to say yes immediately as a kind of penance. The excitement makes their problems seem more interesting and solvable than they might actually be. The anxiety makes me want to research everything about refugee resettlement before I contact them, which should be procrastination disguised as preparation. Beautiful. You're not eliminating the emotions, but you're seeing them clearly enough that they don't have to control your decision-making process unconsciously. Andreas was taking notes in a small journal. This is like debugging code. You don't eliminate all the variables. You make them visible so you can see how they're affecting the output. Perfect analogy, Dr. Whitmore said. Now, what would it look like to make a decision about the refugee organization with full awareness of your emotional filters? Elena sat quietly, feeling the various emotional currents without being swept away by any of them. I think I would contact them, but not as redemption for my previous mistake, and not because I'm certain I can help. I would contact them because I'm genuinely curious about whether my analytical tools could be useful in their context, and I'm willing to discover that they might not be. And how does that feel different from your previous approaches? Lighter, less desperate, like the outcome doesn't have to prove anything about my worth as a person or professional. Rachel looked up from her own note-taking. It's like the difference between gambling and investing. When I was creating those fandom patterns in market data, I was gambling, betting everything on being right. Real investing means making decisions with incomplete information while acknowledging the possibility of loss. That's a profound insight, Rachel. Emotional transparency allows you to think more like an investor than a gambler with your own intellectual capital. As the morning session concluded, Elena felt both exhausted and energized. Examining her emotional filters was like learning to see in a new spectrum of light. Suddenly visible were motivations and influences that had been operating in darkness for years. Walking back to Main House for lunch, she fell into step with Sarah. "Can I ask you something personal?" Elena said, "Of course. Do you ever worry that seeing your emotional filters too clearly will make you less effective? Like, what if some degree of unconscious confidence is necessary for peak performance?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, her medical training evident in the way she considered the question from multiple angles. "I used to think that, but I'm beginning to suspect that unconscious confidence is actually a form of brittleness. It works until it doesn't, and when it fails catastrophically because you have no system for recognizing or correcting the failure. Like my Nordstrom presentation." Exactly. Whereas conscious confidence paired with awareness of its limitations, might be more resilient. It can bend without breaking because it includes the possibility of being wrong. Elena nodded, thinking about the difference between brittle certainty and flexible confidence. It's like the difference between a rigid tree that snaps in a storm and a bamboo that bends but doesn't break. I like that metaphor. The bamboo isn't less strong than a rigid tree. It's strong in a different way. As they reached the main house, Elena realized that something fundamental was shifting in her understanding of expertise itself. She'd always thought of mastery as the elimination of doubt, the achievement of unshakable confidence in one's abilities. But maybe true mastery was something else entirely, the development of such intimate familiarity with one's own limitations that they became sources of strength rather than vulnerability. In her journal that afternoon, she wrote, "Today I learned that I am not my emotions, but I am also not separate from them. The goal isn't to eliminate emotional filters, but to make them transparent. When I can see how fear, excitement, shame, or pride are coloring my perceptions, I can factor that influence into my analysis. But here's what surprised me. Emotional transparency doesn't make me less passionate about my work. If anything, it makes me more curious, more willing to engage with uncertainty. When I'm not defending an identity built on being right, I can afford to be wrong. And when I can afford to be wrong, I'm more likely to discover what's actually true. Question for tomorrow. If I'm not my expertise and I'm not my emotions, then who am I? What remains when all the filters become transparent? Outside her window, the English countryside was beginning to emerge from its morning shroud of mist. The landscape looked different now. Not clear exactly, but more layered, more complex. Elena was beginning to suspect that clarity itself was more nuanced than she'd previously understood. The real work was just beginning. Chapter 4, The Confirmation Trap. The morning of their third day dawned clear and bright, the persistent English rain finally giving way to autumn sunshine that turned the Institute's gardens into a tapestry of gold and crimson. Elena stood at her window with her journal and coffee, watching gardeners tend to beds of late-blooming roses with the methodical care of people who understood that beauty required both patience and precision. She'd been awake since 5, wrestling with a question that had emerged from yesterday's emotional archaeology session. If her feelings filtered everything she perceived, how could she ever trust her own analysis? The question felt simultaneously urgent and unanswerable, like trying to examine your own eyes without a mirror. Her reflection was interrupted by a knock at her door. She opened it to find Rachel, looking unusually agitated, holding a laptop and wearing the expression of someone who had discovered something troubling. "Elena, can I show you something? I've been up all night running analyses, and I think I found a pattern that explains why we're all here." Elena gestured her in, noting the manic energy in Rachel's movements as she set up her laptop on the small desk. The screen filled with spreadsheets, charts, and correlation matrices that looked like the kind of sophisticated analysis Elena associated with Rachel's quantitative background. "Look at this," Rachel said, her words tumbling over each other with excitement. "I've been analyzing the career trajectories of high-performing professionals who experience what Whitmore calls clarity crises. The pattern is unmistakable. It happens to people who achieve expertise in complex domains right around the age of 34. There's a clear correlation with cognitive load, decision fatigue, and what I'm calling pattern saturation." Elena studied the charts, feeling a familiar thrill at the sight of clean data analysis. The correlations look compelling, the methodology sophisticated. "This is impressive work, Rachel. The pattern recognition here is..." She stopped mid-sentence, a cold realization washing over her. "Rachel, when did you say you did this analysis?" "I started around midnight and worked through till about an hour ago." "And the data sources?" Rachel's enthusiasm faltered slightly. "Well, I couldn't access proprietary databases, so I used publicly available information. LinkedIn profiles, company websites, some academic papers. I had to make some assumptions about career satisfaction metrics and..." "Rachel," Elena kept her voice gentle but firm, "what do you think you're doing right now?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Elena watched Rachel's expression shift from excitement to confusion to dawning horror as she realized what Elena was seeing. "Oh, God," Rachel whispered, sinking into the chair beside her laptop. "I'm doing it again, aren't I? I'm finding patterns in noise." Elena nodded. "Beautiful, compelling patterns. Your analysis looks extremely sophisticated. But Rachel, what was your emotional state when you started this work at midnight?" Rachel closed her eyes, her shoulders sagging. "Anxious. Confused about yesterday's session. I felt like I didn't understand what was happening to me, and I wanted to regain control by making sense of it all quantitatively." "And how did it feel when you started seeing the patterns emerge?" "Exciting. Validating. Like I was discovering something important that others had missed." Rachel opened her eyes and stared at her laptop screen. "The same feeling I had when I created the trading algorithm that nearly cost my firm $50 million. Elena sat on the edge of her bed, feeling a mixture of compassion and recognition. "I do the same thing, just with different tools. When I feel uncertain, I create frameworks and analyses that make me feel like I understand the situation. But I'm often just imposing order on complexity rather than truly understanding it. The terrifying part," Rachel said, "is that I can feel how convincing this analysis is, even though I now know it's probably meaningless. My brain wants to believe these patterns are real." A soft knock interrupted them. Dr. Whitmore's voice came through the door. "Elena? Rachel? I thought I might find you together. May I come in?" Elena opened the door to find Dr. Whitmore carrying a breakfast tray and wearing the expression of someone who had anticipated exactly this scenario. "Ah," he said, glancing at Rachel's laptop. "Let me guess. Midnight analysis? Compelling patterns? A sudden sense of clarity about complex phenomena?" Rachel laughed bitterly. "Is it that obvious?" "Rachel, you just demonstrated one of the most important concepts we'll explore today. You've experienced confirmation bias in real time." Dr. Whitmore set the tray on the desk and pulled up the room's single chair. "Can you tell me what you were trying to confirm?" that there was a logical explanation for what we're going through, that our clarity crises follow predictable patterns that I could understand and maybe control. And your brain found exactly the evidence it was looking for. But the correlations are real, Rachel protested, even as she spoke the words with decreasing conviction. The data points exist. I'm sure they do. But Rachel, confirmation bias isn't about fabricating data. It's about selectively gathering, interpreting, and weighting evidence in ways that support what we want to believe. Your analytical skills are excellent, but they were being guided by unconscious emotional needs rather than genuine inquiry. Elena leaned forward. So the problem isn't that Rachel lacks analytical ability. It's that her need for certainty was driving the analysis rather than curiosity about what might actually be true. Precisely. And this brings us to today's central challenge. Dr. Whitmore stood and walked to a window, looking out at the gardeners who are now pruning roses with careful attention to each individual plant. How do we learn to seek disconfirming evidence, information that challenges what we want to believe? After they gathered the full group in the practice room, Dr. Whitmore introduced what he called the Devil's Advocate Protocol, a structured approach to actively seeking evidence that contradicted their most cherished professional beliefs. The human brain, he explained, is fundamentally a pattern-matching machine. It looks for information that fits existing patterns and tends to dismiss or ignore information that doesn't fit. This served our ancestors well when quick pattern recognition could mean the difference between safety and danger. But in today's complex world, the same mechanism can trap us in false certainties. He drew a simple diagram on the whiteboard, a stick figure with arrows pointing toward it labeled confirming evidence, and arrows pointing away from it labeled disconfirming evidence. Notice how the figure naturally receives a confirming evidence, while the disconfirming evidence flows past unused. We're not consciously rejecting challenging information. We're simply not perceiving it as relevant. Sarah raised her hand. In medicine, we try to counteract this with differential diagnosis, actively considering alternative explanations for symptoms. But even then, I find myself gravitating toward the diagnoses that fit my initial impression. Exactly. And the more expert you become, the stronger this gravitational pull becomes. Your brain has seen similar patterns before, so it jumps quickly to familiar conclusions. Dr. Whitmore turned back to the group. Today, we're going to practice reversing this natural tendency. He handed each of them a sheet of paper with instructions for what he called belief auditing. I want you to identify one professional belief that you hold with high confidence, something you're certain about based on your experience and expertise. Then, I want you to spend 30 minutes actively searching for evidence that contradicts this belief. Elena stared at the blank paper, her mind immediately offering up dozens of beliefs she held with complete confidence. But as she considered which one to examine, she realized that her strongest beliefs felt too fundamental to question. The resistance itself was telling. Finally, she wrote, "Belief. Comprehensive analysis always leads to better decisions than quick, intuitive judgments." This felt like attacking the foundation of her professional identity, but that very feeling suggested it was exactly the right belief to examine. Andreas was writing, "Belief. Disruption comes from outside established industries, not from within them." Sarah chose, "Belief. More diagnostic testing generally leads to more accurate diagnoses." Rachel, after her morning revelation, selected, "Belief. Quantitative analysis is more reliable than qualitative assessment." "Now," Dr. Whitmore said, "I want you to become prosecutors building a case against your own beliefs. Don't try to be fair or balanced. We'll address the confirming evidence later. For the next 30 minutes, be ruthlessly one-sided in seeking disconfirming evidence." Elena began her search with the kind of systematic approach she brought to client problems, but immediately noticed her mind's resistance. Every piece of contradictory evidence she found seemed flawed, irrelevant, or based on exceptional circumstances that didn't apply to her usual context. She pushed through the resistance, forcing herself to document examples of successful quick decisions, studies showing analysis paralysis, cases where overthinking had led to worse outcomes and immediate action. The evidence was there, but she could feel her mind working to minimize its significance. 20 minutes into the exercise, she had an unsettling realization. The evidence against comprehensive analysis wasn't just present, it was abundant. There were entire fields of research on the limitations of excessive analysis, documented cases where quick intuitive decisions outperformed lengthy deliberation, and examples from her own experience that she had dismissed as anomalies. Across the room, she could see her colleagues wrestling with similar revelations. Andreas was staring at his laptop screen with the expression of someone whose worldview was actively crumbling. Sarah was taking notes with the mechanical precision of someone who had trained herself to document uncomfortable truths. Rachel had stopped typing entirely and was sitting with her head in her hands. "Time," Dr. Whitmore called. "How was that experience?" "Disturbing," Elena said immediately. "I found more contradictory evidence than I expected, but what bothered me most was noticing how hard I was working to dismiss it. My belief about disruption coming from outside industries," Andreas said, "turns out to be contradicted by dozens of examples I already knew about but had somehow categorized as exceptions rather than counter-evidence." Sarah nodded grimly. "I found studies showing that excessive diagnostic testing can lead to false positives, unnecessary treatments, and worse patient outcomes. The evidence was hiding in plain sight." Rachel looked up from her hands. "I think I need to question whether I actually believe in quantitative analysis or whether I just feel safer with numbers because they give me an illusion of control." Dr. Whitmore wrote their responses on the whiteboard. "What you've experienced is called the disconfirmation shock, the disturbing recognition of how much contradictory evidence we routinely ignore or dismiss. But here's the crucial insight. This doesn't mean your original beliefs were wrong. It means they were incomplete." He drew a new diagram showing a figure actively reaching for both confirming and disconfirming evidence. Mature thinking requires what we call intellectual courage, the willingness to actively seek information that challenges our most cherished beliefs, not to destroy those beliefs, but to refine them into more nuanced, accurate understanding. Elena raised her hand. "But doesn't this lead to paralysis? If I question every belief, every analysis, every decision, how do I ever act with confidence?" "Beautiful question. Let's explore it. Andreas, after finding evidence against your belief about disruption, how you feel about advising clients on innovation strategy?" Andreas was quiet for a moment, actually more confident, not less, "because now I'm aware of a blind spot I didn't know I had. I can look for innovation opportunities both inside and outside industries, rather than just focusing on external disruption." "Exactly. Intellectual courage doesn't destroy confidence. It makes confidence more flexible, more responsive to new information." "Rachel, how might your analysis change if you actively incorporated the limitations of quantitative approaches?" "I could use quantitative analysis as one input among many, rather than treating it as the ultimate arbiter of truth. Maybe combine it with qualitative insights, intuitive assessments, historical context." Rachel looked surprised by her own words. "That actually sounds more intellectually rigorous, not less." Dr. Whitmore nodded. "What you're discovering is that strong beliefs paired with active skepticism create what we call dynamic confidence, certainty that includes its own willingness to evolve." Elena found herself thinking about the Nordstrom presentation again, but from a different angle. "I think what went wrong with my analysis wasn't that I believed too strongly in comprehensive analysis, but that I believed in it too rigidly. I never questioned whether that particular situation called for a different approach." "Yes, and notice the emotional difference between rigid certainty and flexible confidence. How does each feel in your body?" Elena closed her eyes and tried to embody each state. "Rigid certainty feels tight, defensive, like I'm protecting something fragile. Flexible confidence feels more relaxed, but also more alert, like I'm ready to learn something new without losing my foundation." Sarah leaned forward. "It's like the difference between a medieval fortress and a modern building designed for earthquakes. The fortress looks stronger, but it's brittle. The earthquake-resistant building sways with the ground instead of fighting it." "Perfect analogy," Dr. Whitmore said. "Now, let's take this practice deeper. I want you to choose someone in your professional life who frequently disagrees with your approach. Instead of thinking about why they're wrong, I want you to actively seek evidence that they might be right about something important. Elena immediately thought of Thomas Erickson, a colleague at Meridian who favored rapid prototyping over her more analytical approach. She'd always viewed Thomas as intellectually sloppy, someone who jumped to solutions without proper foundation. But now, trying to build a case for his perspective, she remembered several projects where his quick iterations had led to insights that her careful analysis had missed. The exercise felt like deliberately walking into intellectual vertigo, but there was something exhilarating about it too. Instead of defending her position, she was exploring territory she'd never allowed herself to consider. The hardest part, Andrea said as they discussed their experiences, is that seeking disconfirming evidence feels like betraying my own expertise. Like I'm undermining the very foundation of my professional competence. But what if, Dr. Whitmore asked, your expertise became more valuable precisely because it included awareness of its own limitations? Elena, would you trust a consultant more if they could articulate not only what they were good at, but also what situations their approach might not be ideal for? Elena felt something click into place. Actually, yes. It would make their recommendations feel more honest, more tailored to my specific situation, rather than just their general methodology. So intellectual courage isn't professional suicide, Sarah said slowly. It's professional evolution. Exactly. But it requires giving up something precious, the comfortable certainty that comes with never questioning yourself. The question is, what do you gain in return? Elena thought about her morning conversation with Rachel, about the way they caught each other's confirmation bias in real time. There had been something deeply satisfying about that recognition, a sense of intellectual intimacy that came from seeing clearly together. You gain the ability to think with other people instead of just presenting to them, she said. When you're not defending a position, you can actually explore ideas collaboratively. And you gain resilience, Andreas added. If you know the weaknesses in your approach, you can compensate for them or know when to use different approaches entirely. Dr. Whitmore smiled. What you're describing is the difference between brittle expertise and anti-fragile expertise. Competence that actually gets stronger when challenged. As the session concluded, Elena felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. Actively seeking disconfirming evidence was like learning to use muscles she'd never developed. Intellectually strenuous, but oddly energizing. Walking back to Main House for lunch, she fell into step with Rachel, who was still looking somewhat shaken by her midnight analysis revelation. How are you feeling about this morning? Elena asked. Like I've been living in a hall of mirrors, Rachel replied. Seeing patterns everywhere, but never questioning whether they were reflections or reality. But also relieved? Like I finally understand why I kept making the same mistakes despite being technically competent. The confirmation bias? Not just that. The emotional need for certainty that was driving the bias. Once I see that need clearly, I can choose whether to feed it or question it. Elena nodded. They walked in comfortable silence for a moment, both processing the morning's revelations. Can I ask you something? Rachel said finally. Do you think there's a difference between healthy skepticism and destructive doubt? Like, how do we question our beliefs without becoming paralyzed by uncertainty? Elena considered the question. I think maybe the difference is in intention. Healthy skepticism seeks truth, even if it's uncomfortable. Destructive doubt seeks reasons not to act, not to commit, not to be vulnerable to being wrong. So it's about moving towards something rather than away from something. Yes, moving toward clearer understanding rather than away from the discomfort of uncertainty. As they reached the dining room, Elena realized that something fundamental had shifted in her relationship with her own expertise. She was still confident in her analytical abilities, but that confidence now included genuine humility about what she didn't know and couldn't see. In her journal that evening, she wrote, "Today I learned that confirmation bias isn't a flaw in my thinking. It's a natural tendency that becomes dangerous only when it operates unconsciously. The antidote isn't to eliminate the tendency, but to balance it with active skepticism. But the deeper lesson is about the emotional courage required for genuine intellectual growth. Seeking disconfirming evidence isn't just a cognitive exercise. It requires facing the fear of being wrong, the discomfort of uncertainty, the vulnerability of not knowing. When I can sit with that vulnerability without rushing to fill it with false certainty, something new becomes possible. not the absence of belief, but beliefs that include their own willingness to evolve. Question for tomorrow. If my expertise is becoming more flexible, more responsive to contradiction, what stays constant? What is the unchanging core that allows everything else to change? Outside her window, the countryside was settling into dusk, the last light revealing the underlying structure of the landscape, the ancient field boundaries, the old stone walls, the pathways worn by centuries of feet. All of it had endured precisely because it had learned to bend without breaking, to adapt without losing its essential character. Elena was beginning to suspect that the same principle might apply to the landscape of the mind. Chapter 5. The Dissonance Within. Elena awoke on their fourth morning at Thornfield to find herself staring at the ceiling, caught between sleep and wakefulness by a dream that felt more like a memory. She'd been standing in her Copenhagen office, confidently presenting to the Nordstrom executives, but every time she opened her mouth to speak, different words emerged, words that contradicted everything she prepared to say. "I believe comprehensive analysis is crucial," she heard herself saying, "but I've just realized I make most of my important decisions intuitively, then reverse engineer the logical justification afterward." In the dream, Nordstrom had leaned forward with genuine interest. "Tell us more about that contradiction, Ms. Reeves. How do you reconcile believing one thing and doing another?" Elena had felt her dream self flush with embarrassment and confusion, unable to answer a question that cut to the heart of something she'd never consciously examined. Now, fully awake in her simple room at Thornfield, she realized the dream had surfaced a truth she'd been avoiding, the gap between her stated methodology and her actual practice. She reached for her journal and wrote, "I preach systematic analysis, but often trust my gut instincts. I advocate for data-driven decisions, but frequently cherry-pick data that supports conclusions I've already reached intuitively. I believe in collaborative problem-solving, but often present my ideas as if they emerge from pure logic rather than admitting they came from hunches I then validated." The writing felt like a confession, but also like a relief. She was naming something that had been operating in shadows, creating an internal tension she'd been too busy to acknowledge. A knock at her door interrupted her reflection. "Elena? It's Sarah. Are you awake?" Elena wrapped a robe around herself and opened the door to find Sarah looking as unsettled as Elena felt. The surgeon's usual composure was replaced by something more vulnerable, the look of someone who had encountered an uncomfortable truth about themselves. "I need to talk to someone," Sarah said. "I've been lying here since 4 a.m. thinking about yesterday's disconfirmation exercise, and I've realized something disturbing about my medical practice." Elena gestured her in and put the kettle on. Her room came equipped with a simple tea service, perhaps in recognition that deep learning often happened in informal moments. "What did you realize?" Sarah sat heavily in the window chair, staring out at the morning mist that clung to the Institute's gardens. "You know how I chose to examine my belief that more diagnostic testing leads to more accurate diagnoses?" Elena nodded, settling into the desk chair with her journal still open. "Well, I found plenty of evidence that excessive testing can harm patients. False positives, unnecessary procedures, delayed treatment while waiting for test results. But here's what's been keeping me awake. Even though I intellectually understand these risks, I still order more tests than necessary in difficult cases. Why do you think that is? Legal protection, partly. It's harder to be sued for doing too much than for doing too little. But that's not the whole story." Sarah's voice grew quiet. "I think I order extra tests because they make me feel more confident, even when they don't actually improve diagnostic accuracy. The tests aren't for the patients. They're for my own anxiety about being wrong." Elena felt a chill of recognition. "You're describing a gap between what you believe is right and what you actually do." "Exactly. And the disturbing part is that I've been unconscious of this gap for years. I genuinely thought I was practicing evidence-based medicine, but I was actually practicing anxiety-based medicine while convincing myself it was evidence-based." Elena looked down at her journal, at her own confession written in hurried handwriting. "Sarah, can I share something with you? I think I'm facing something similar." She read aloud what she'd written, watching Sarah's expression shift from surprise to understanding to something approaching relief. "So we're both living contradictions," Sarah said. "Believing one thing, doing another, and somehow managing not to notice the gap. Until now. Sarah accepted a cup of tea with the careful gratitude of someone who needed the ritual of warm comfort. But what do we do with this recognition? How do you live with seeing your own inconsistencies so clearly? Elena considered the question. In her corporate world, inconsistency was weakness, something to be eliminated or hidden. But here, in the quiet honesty of this conversation, it felt less like a flaw to be fixed and more like a human complexity to be understood. Maybe, she said slowly, the goal isn't to eliminate the inconsistency, but to be conscious of it, to acknowledge the gap between ideals and practice instead of pretending it doesn't exist. Their conversation was interrupted by the breakfast bell, a gentle chime that had become their signal to gather for the morning meal. As they walked to the dining room together, Elena felt a strange combination of vulnerability and solidarity. There was something powerful about witnessing each other's internal contradictions without judgment. Dr. Whitmore was already seated when they arrived, along with Andreas and Rachel, both of whom looked like they'd also spent a restless night processing uncomfortable insights. The dining room felt different this morning, less like a gathering of successful professionals, and more like a support group for people confronting difficult truths about themselves. "I can see from your faces," Dr. Whitmore said as they settled around a familiar table, "that yesterday's work has continued overnight. Who would like to share what's surfacing for you?" Andreas raised his hand tentatively. "I've been thinking about the disruption belief I examined yesterday. I found evidence that innovation often comes from within established industries, but here's what's bothering me. Even knowing this, I still feel more excited by external disruption stories. It's like my intellectual understanding isn't changing my emotional preferences." Rachel nodded vigorously. "I'm experiencing something similar. I can see the limitations of quantitative analysis clearly now, but when I'm stressed or uncertain, I still default to creating mathematical models even when I know they might be inappropriate for the situation. And I order unnecessary medical tests despite understanding their limitations," Sarah added. "It's like there's a gap between what I know and what I do." Elena looked around the table at her cohort members, each struggling with the same fundamental challenge. "We're all describing the same thing, aren't we? The space between our stated beliefs and our actual behavior." "Yes," Dr. Whitmore said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction that suggested they'd arrived exactly where he'd hoped they would. "You're describing cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort that arises when our actions contradict our beliefs or when we hold two conflicting beliefs simultaneously." He stood and walked to the whiteboard that had become a familiar fixture of their morning discussions. "Most people experience cognitive dissonance as something to be resolved quickly. The mental tension feels uncomfortable, so they either change their beliefs to match their actions, change their actions to match their beliefs, or rationalize away the contradiction." Elena thought about the dream that had awakened her, the way her unconscious mind had surfaced the contradiction between her stated methodology and her actual practice. "But you're suggesting there's value in sitting with the dissonance rather than rushing to resolve it?" "I'm suggesting that the dissonance contains important information. Andreas, when you feel more excited by external disruption stories despite knowing that internal innovation is equally valuable, what is that excitement telling you?" Andreas frowned, turning his attention inward. "I suppose that I'm drawn to narratives of dramatic transformation. The idea of overturning established order appeals to me emotionally, even when I know intellectually that gradual evolution might be more effective." "And what might that preference reveal about your own psychological makeup?" "That I might be more motivated by rebellion than by optimization. That I might choose consulting projects based on their narrative appeal rather than their practical impact." Dr. Whitmore nodded approvingly. "So the dissonance isn't a flaw to be corrected. It's a window into hidden aspects of your decision-making process. Sarah, what might your tendency to order extra tests reveal about your underlying fears?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "That I'm more afraid of missing something than of causing harm through overtreatment. That my professional identity is built more on avoiding criticism than on optimizing patient outcomes." These are profound insights. But notice what happens when you try to simply resolve the dissonance by forcing your behavior to match your stated beliefs. Rachel leaned forward. "You become rigid." When I've tried to force myself to use only qualitative methods, I become anxious and second-guess every decision. The dissonance doesn't disappear. It just goes underground. Exactly. Because the dissonance exists for a reason. There's often wisdom in both sides of the contradiction. Elena, what would happen if you tried to eliminate your intuitive decision-making in favor of pure systematic analysis? Elena thought about the time she'd attempted exactly that, usually in response to criticism or failure. I become paralyzed. The analysis becomes endless because I'm trying to eliminate all uncertainty before acting. And ironically, I often end up making worse decisions because I've disconnected from the pattern recognition and contextual awareness that inform good intuition. So the goal isn't to resolve the dissonance, but to dance with it consciously, to be aware of the tension between different aspects of your expertise, and to consciously choose which aspect to emphasize in different situations. Dr. Whitmore drew a figure 8 on a whiteboard, labeling one loop stated beliefs and the other actual behavior, with arrows showing movement between them. What if, instead of trying to eliminate the gap between beliefs and behavior, you learn to navigate it deliberately, to be conscious of when you're operating from stated beliefs versus when you're operating from deeper, perhaps less articulated values and preferences? Elena stared at the diagram, feeling something shift in her understanding. You're describing integration rather than consistency, bringing all parts of myself into consciousness rather than trying to make them identical. Beautiful. And what would that look like in practice? Elena thought about her approaching return to Copenhagen, to client presentations and strategic recommendations. I could acknowledge when my recommendations are based on intuition that I validated analytically versus when they're based on pure systematic analysis. I could be transparent about the difference rather than presenting everything as if it emerged from the same logical process. That sounds terrifying, Andrea said. Admitting that some of my innovation strategies come from emotional preferences rather than rigorous methodology. Why terrifying? Because it feels unprofessional. Like I'm admitting to being less scientific than I claim to be. Dr. Whitmore smiled. But what if the opposite were true? What if acknowledging the full complexity of your decision-making process, including its emotional and intuitive components, actually made you more trustworthy to clients? Sarah looked thoughtful. In medicine, patients often appreciate when doctors acknowledge uncertainty or explain their reasoning process. The ones who present everything as absolute certainty actually seem less credible. Precisely. Conscious integration of your contradictions can create what we call authentic expertise, competence that includes honest awareness of its own complexity. The morning session continued with an exercise Dr. Whitmore called dissonance mapping. Each participant identified their key professional contradictions and explored what information each side of the contradiction contained. Elena mapped her systematic analysis versus intuitive decision-making tension and discovered that her intuition was particularly strong in situations involving human psychology and organizational dynamics, while her systematic analysis was most valuable for financial modeling and operational optimization. The dissonance wasn't a flaw. It was evidence that she had multiple types of intelligence that were valuable in different contexts. Andreas found that his preference for external disruption stories revealed important information about his own creativity and motivation patterns. His best work came when he could frame internal innovation as a form of internal disruption, revolutionary change that happened to occur within existing organizations. Sarah realized that her tendency toward overtesting reflected not just anxiety, but also a deep commitment to thoroughness that was valuable when carefully applied. The key was learning to distinguish between situations that genuinely required comprehensive testing and those where it was counterproductive. Rachel's mathematical modeling impulse, she discovered, was often her way of processing uncertainty in situations that were fundamentally ambiguous. The models weren't valuable as predictive tools, but as thinking tools, ways of clarifying assumptions and exploring scenarios. What you're each discovering, Dr. Whitmore observed, is that cognitive dissonance often points toward untapped aspect of your expertise. The parts of yourself that don't fit your professional self-image may be exactly the parts that could differentiate your work in the marketplace. Elena felt a flutter of excitement. The idea that her contradictions could be competitive advantages rather than professional weaknesses was simultaneously liberating and frightening. But how do you present this integration to clients? She asked. How do you say my recommendation is based partly on systematic analysis and partly on intuition without seeming unprofessional? By reframing expertise itself, Dr. Whitmore said, instead of presenting yourself as someone who has eliminated uncertainty and contradiction, you present yourself as someone who can navigate uncertainty and contradiction skillfully. Instead of pretending to be a machine that produces optimal solutions, you acknowledge being a human who brings multiple forms of intelligence to complex problems. Rachel was taking notes rapidly. This reminds me of jazz musicians. They don't eliminate improvisation in favor of precise notation. They integrate both. The written music provides structure, and improvisation provides responsiveness to the moment. Perfect analogy. And notice that the best jazz musicians aren't the ones who can either read music or improvise. They're the ones who can do both and know when to emphasize each skill. As the morning session concluded, Elena felt a shift in how she understood her own expertise. Instead of seeing her contradictions as evidence of intellectual failure, she was beginning to see them as evidence of intellectual complexity that could be leveraged rather than hidden. Walking in the Institute's gardens after lunch, she found herself in conversation with Andreas about the practical challenges of integrating dissonance. The hardest part for me, he said, is that integrating contradictions feels like admitting I don't have clear answers. And clients hire consultants because they want clear answers. Elena nodded. But what if clients actually want something else? What if they want confidence that their advisor can navigate complexity rather than certainty that there's one right answer? You mean reframing expertise from having answers to managing questions? Something like that. When I think about the advisors I trust most, they're not the ones who always sound certain. They're the ones who acknowledge complexity while still being able to act decisively within it. They paused at a bench overlooking a small pond where ducks moved in apparently random patterns that somehow created an overall sense of harmony. Elena found herself thinking about emergence, the way complex systems could exhibit coherent behavior without central control, the way her own contradictions might create a more sophisticated form of expertise rather than professional chaos. Andreas, can I tell you something that might sound strange? Of course. I think I'm more confident now than I was when I arrived here 4 days ago. Not because I have more certainty about what I know, but because I have more clarity about what I don't know and how to work with that uncertainty. Andreas was quiet for a moment, watching the ducks navigate their seemingly chaotic but somehow elegant dance. You know what? I think I understand what you mean. When I was pretending to have eliminated my contradictions, I was constantly anxious about being exposed as inconsistent. Now that I'm owning the contradictions consciously, there's nothing to hide. Exactly. The energy I was using to maintain a false consistency can now go into genuine problem solving. That evening, Elena wrote in her journal, "Today I learned that cognitive dissonance isn't a bug in my thinking. It's a feature. The tension between different aspects of my expertise contains valuable information about when to apply which forms of intelligence. But more than that, I learned that authenticity might be the ultimate professional advantage. When I stop pretending to be a perfectly consistent decision-making machine and acknowledge the full complexity of how I actually think, I become more trustworthy, not less. The question is no longer, how do I eliminate my contradictions? But how do I dance with them consciously? Tomorrow, if my contradictions can be integrated rather than resolved, what does that mean for how I present myself professionally? How do I maintain credibility while acknowledging complexity?" Outside her window, the English countryside was settling into evening, the landscape holding multiple types of beauty simultaneously. The geometric precision of cultivated fields and the organic chaos of wild hedgerows, ancient and modern structures coexisting in apparent contradiction that somehow created a more interesting whole. Elena was beginning to suspect that the same principle might apply to the landscape of professional expertise. Chapter 6. The Mirror Judgment. The fifth morning at Thornfield dawned gray and still, the kind of English weather that seemed designed for introspection. Elena had spent the previous evening walking the Institute's grounds, processing the revelations about cognitive dissonance that had emerged during their session. She felt lighter somehow, as if acknowledging her contradictions had released tension she hadn't known she was carrying. But as she descended to breakfast, she encountered a scene that immediately trigger her old analytical reflexes. Andreas was at a corner table, speaking intently into his phone with a kind of urgent energy that suggested a business crisis. His voice carried across the quiet dining room, something about market timing and competitive advantage, and the need for immediate strategic pivots. Elena felt an immediate surge of irritation. Here they were, engaged in deep work about conscious thinking, and Andreas was reverting to the same reactive consultant behaviors that had likely contributed to his problems in the first place. Couldn't he maintain focus for even a week? Didn't he understand that this kind of scattered attention was exactly what they were here to address? She poured herself coffee and chose a seat deliberately distant from Andreas's table, but found herself unable to ignore his conversation. Every phrase seemed to confirm her assessment. He was operating from the same impulsive innovation mythology they'd been examining, treating every business challenge as if it required immediate disruption rather than thoughtful analysis. Quite a strong reaction, a familiar voice observed. Elena looked up to find Dr. Whitmore settling into the chair across from her, carrying his own coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd been watching her internal process with professional interest. "I'm sorry. Your body language, your choice of seating, the way you're listening to Andreas's conversation while pretending not to. You're having quite a strong emotional response to his phone call." Elena felt a flush of embarrassment at being so transparent. He's just reverting to type. We've been talking about the dangers of reactive thinking, and here he is making urgent strategic recommendations based on partial information. I see. And what emotion are you feeling as you watch him do this? The question made Elena pause. She'd been so focused on analyzing Andreas's behavior that she hadn't examined her own emotional state. Frustration, I suppose, and disappointment that he's not applying what we've been learning. Anything else? Elena turned her attention inward, tried to identify the full spectrum of what she was experiencing. Superiority, maybe? Like I'm handling this process better than he is. Dr. Whitmore nodded slowly. Elena, can I suggest an experiment? Of course. Instead of analyzing Andreas's conversation, I'd like you to analyze your own reaction to it. What specifically about his behavior is triggering such strong feelings in you? Elena looked back toward Andreas, who was now gesturing animatedly while discussing some kind of product launch strategy. He's being impulsive, making recommendations without sufficient reflection, operating from the same pattern-matching instincts that got him into trouble. And why does that bother you so much? The question felt simple, but as Elena considered it, she realized her answer wasn't as straightforward as she'd assumed. Because it's ineffective? Because it reinforces the kind of reactive consulting that gives our profession a bad reputation. Those sound like reasonable concerns. But I'm curious about the intensity of your reaction. You seem more personally offended than professionally concerned. Elena frowned, sensing that Dr. Whitmore was leading her towards some recognition she wasn't yet ready to see. What are you suggesting? I'm wondering if Andreas is doing something that you also do, but don't want to acknowledge in yourself. The suggestion hit Elena like cold water. She opened her mouth to deny it, then stopped as a series of uncomfortable memories surfaced. Her rushed analysis of the Nordstrom situation, the time she'd made strategic recommendations based on pattern recognition rather than comprehensive analysis, the way she'd often presented quick, intuitive assessments as if they emerged from careful deliberation. "Oh," she said quietly, "what are you recognizing?" "That I'm criticizing Andreas for doing exactly what I do. The reactive consulting, the quick strategic pivots based on limited information. I've built half my reputation on being able to size up complex situations quickly and provide immediate strategic direction." Dr. Whitmore leaned back in his chair. "And how does it feel to see your own behavior reflected in someone else?" Elena watched Andreas wrap up his phone call, noting how energized he looked, how confident in his rapid-fire recommendations. It was uncomfortably familiar, embarrassing, and frustrating, because I can see so clearly why it's problematic when he does it, but I've been blind to the same patterns in myself. "What you're experiencing," Dr. Whitmore said, "is called psychological projection. We tend to be most critical of behaviors in others that reflect aspects of ourselves we haven't fully acknowledged or integrated." As if summoned by their conversation, Andreas approached their table, looking slightly sheepish about his extended phone call. "Sorry about that," he said, pulling up a chair. "Client crisis. They're facing a competitive threat and wanted immediate strategic guidance. I probably should have told them to wait until I'm back in London, but you couldn't resist jumping in with rapid strategic recommendations?" Elena said, her voice carrying more edge than she'd intended. Andreas looked surprised by her tone. "Well, yes, that's what they pay me for, quick strategic insights based on pattern recognition. Even though we've been discussing how that kind of reactive consulting can be problematic, Elena," Dr. Whitmore said gently, "what's happening right now?" Elena realized she was doing exactly what Dr. Whitmore had just helped her identify, criticizing Andreas for behavior that mirrored her own unacknowledged patterns. But the recognition didn't immediately dissolve her irritation. If anything, it intensified it. "I'm projecting," she said. "I'm criticizing Andreas for the same reactive consulting approach that I use, because it's easier to see the problems with it when someone else is doing it." Andreas looked confused. "Wait, what?" Dr. Whitmore gestured to include Andreas in conversation. "Elena has just recognized that her strong reaction to your phone call might have more to do with seeing her own consulting patterns reflected in your behavior than with any objective assessment of your decision-making." Andreas was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then, unexpectedly, he began to laugh. "You know what's funny? I had almost the exact same reaction yesterday when I watched Rachel creating those mathematical models. I kept thinking she's just imposing quantitative structure on qualitative problems. But now I realize I do the same thing with innovation frameworks." "And I," came Sarah's voice from behind them, "spent most of yesterday judging Elena's tendency to overanalyze medical decisions, only to realize this morning that I do the same thing with diagnostic protocols." She pulled up a chair to join their impromptu circle, followed shortly by Rachel, who looked like she'd been wrestling with similar insights. "So we're all mirrors for each other," Rachel said. "The behaviors that annoy us most in others are the ones we're most blind to in ourselves." Dr. Whitmore nodded. "Projection is one of the most powerful tools for self-awareness, precisely because it reveals our blind spots so clearly. The qualities that trigger strong emotional reactions in others are often the qualities we haven't fully owned in ourselves." Elena thought about her years of consulting, remembering the colleagues who had annoyed her most intensely. Thomas Erickson, who she'd always criticized for being too intuitive, too willing to trust his gut without systematic validation. But wasn't that exactly what she did when she made rapid client assessments based on pattern recognition? "It's like we're surrounded by mirrors," she said, "but instead of seeing our own reflection, we think we're looking at other people." Exactly. And the stronger the emotional reaction, the more likely it is that you're seeing something in yourself. Elena, what would it mean to own the same reactive consulting tendencies that you criticize in Andreas? Elena considered the question. "I suppose it would mean acknowledging that my expertise includes both careful analysis and rapid pattern matching, and that both have value when used appropriately. Instead of pretending I only do systematic analysis, I could be honest about when I'm drawing on intuitive assessment. And Andreas, what would it mean to own the same overanalytical tendencies that you criticize in others? That my innovation work is most effective when it includes both disruptive creativity and careful systematic thinking. That the people I've dismissed as overanalytical might actually have skills that complement my creative instincts." Sarah leaned forward. "This is fascinating. We each seem to be projecting our own disowned aspects onto others. I criticize overanalysis because I'm uncomfortable with my own tendency to overthink. Elena criticizes reactive consulting because she's uncomfortable with her own intuitive decision-making. And I," Rachel added, "criticize qualitative mushiness because I'm uncomfortable with the limits of quantitative analysis." Dr. Whitmore stood and walked to their now familiar whiteboard, drawing a simple diagram of figures pointing at each other with arrows labeled "What I criticize in you" and "What I disown in myself." "Projection serves an important psychological function," he explained. "It allows us to maintain our self-image by externalizing the aspect of ourselves that don't fit our identity. But it also creates tremendous blind spots and interpersonal conflict." Elena studied the diagram, thinking about her relationship with various colleagues over the years. So the people who annoyed me most were probably the ones who had the most to teach me about my own blind spots. Quite possibly. And the reverse is also true. You may have been most annoying to people who are struggling with their own versions of the qualities you embody. Andreas rubbed his temples. This is making me think about my business partnerships. The ones that failed most dramatically were usually with people whose approaches I found most irritating. I always assumed it was because we were incompatible, but maybe we were too compatible. Mirror images of each other's disowned aspects. That's a profound insight. What would it have looked like to see those partners as mirrors rather than opposites? I would have been curious about what their approaches could teach me instead of defensive about why my approach was superior. Instead of fighting about methodology, we could have explored how to integrate different approaches. Dr. Whitmore turned back to the group. This morning, I want you to try an experiment in what we call shadow integration. Think of someone in your professional life who consistently annoys or frustrates you. Instead of analyzing what's wrong with them, I want you to explore what aspect of yourself might be reflected in their behavior. Elena immediately thought of Thomas Erickson again, but this time with curiosity rather than irritation. What if his intuitive approach wasn't intellectual sloppiness, but a different form of intelligence that she'd been too defensive to appreciate? The goal, Dr. Whitmore continued, isn't to excuse problematic behavior in others, but to reclaim the projective energy you've been directing outward and use it for self-understanding instead. They spent the next hour in individual reflection, each exploring their professional relationships through the lens of projection. Elena found herself making a list of colleagues who had triggered strong reactions in her, then looking for corresponding patterns in her own behavior. The exercise was humbling. Thomas's intuitive decision-making reflected her own tendency to trust pattern recognition over systematic analysis. Margaret's perfectionism mirrored her own difficulty accepting work that didn't meet impossibly high standards. David's tendency to overpromise reflected her own habit of committing to deliverables before fully understanding their complexity. When they reconvened, the sharing was remarkable for its honesty. I realized, Andrea said, that I've been most critical of established companies' resistance to change, but I'm incredibly resistant to changing my own innovation methodologies. Sarah nodded, and I've been most frustrated with colleagues who second-guess their clinical decisions, but I do exactly the same thing. I just hide it better. Rachel looked almost embarrassed. I judge people for being unscientific in their thinking, but my own scientific methods are often just sophisticated ways of confirming what I already believe. Elena took a breath. I think I've been most annoyed by colleagues who present their intuitions as if they were systematic analyses. But that's exactly what I do. I just reverse engineer the logical framework after I've reached my intuitive conclusion. Dr. Whitmore wrote their insights on the whiteboard. What you're each discovering is that projection creates a kind of intellectual blindness. Instead of seeing the full spectrum of your own capabilities, you split them, owning the parts that fit your professional identity and projecting the parts that don't. But when you reclaim the projections, Elena said slowly, you get access to a more complete version of yourself. Exactly. Andreas, what would your consulting practice look like if you owned both your disruptive creativity and your analytical carefulness? Andreas was quiet for a moment, more robust, less brittle. I could adapt my approach to what each situation actually needed instead of always defaulting to the same innovation playbook. And Elena, what would your practice look like if you owned both your systematic analysis and your intuitive pattern matching? More honest, more flexible. I could acknowledge when I'm drawing on different types of intelligence instead of pretending everything comes from the same logical process. Dr. Whitmore smiled. What you're describing is what we call integrated expertise, the ability to access the full range of your capabilities consciously rather than being limited by your professional self-image. As the morning session concluded, Elena felt a shift in how she understood her relationships with colleagues. Instead of seeing differences as threats to her methodology, she could see them as mirrors reflecting aspects of herself that she hadn't fully integrated. Walking in the gardens after lunch, she found herself in conversation with Rachel about the practical implications of shadow integration. The hardest part for me, Rachel said, is that owning my projections makes me less certain about who's right and who's wrong in professional disagreements. Elena nodded, but maybe that uncertainty is more honest. Maybe most professional conflicts aren't about right versus wrong, but about different aspects of complex problems that we're each seeing partially. So instead of trying to win arguments, we could try to understand what each perspective contributes to a fuller understanding. Yes, it's like that old story about blind people touching different parts of an elephant and arguing about what it is. None of them are wrong. They're just experiencing different aspects of the same reality. They pause at a bench overlooking the pond where ducks move in their mysteriously coordinated patterns. Elena found herself thinking about her upcoming return to Copenhagen, to the world of client presentations and strategic recommendations. Rachel, can I ask you something? Of course. How you think this changes how we present ourselves professionally? If we own our full range of capabilities instead of just the ones that fit our brand, doesn't that make us seem less specialized, less expert? Rachel considered the question. I think it might make us seem more trustworthy. When someone acknowledges the limitations of their approach and can articulate when other approaches might be more valuable, I trust their recommendations more, not less. Like a doctor who can explain both what they know and what they don't know, both what they can treat and when you need a specialist. Exactly. Expertise that includes its own boundaries feels more mature than expertise that claims to have no boundaries. That evening, Elena wrote in her journal, "Today I discovered that my strongest professional irritations are mirrors reflecting aspects of myself I haven't fully owned. The colleagues who annoy me most are often the ones who have the most to teach me about my own blind spots. But the deeper insight is about integration. Instead of splitting my capabilities into acceptable and unacceptable parts, I can own the full range of how I actually think and work. This doesn't make me less expert. It makes me more consciously expert. Tomorrow, if I'm integrating my shadow aspects, what does that mean for how I relate to colleagues? How do I move from competitive judgment to collaborative curiosity?" Outside her window, the English countryside held its complex beauty, ancient hedgerows and modern farms, wild growth and careful cultivation, all somehow creating a more interesting whole than any single approach to land use could achieve. Elena was beginning to understand that the same integration might be possible within the landscape of professional identity. Chapter 7, The Art of Reframing. Elena's sixth morning at Thornfield began with an unexpected phone call from Marcus in Copenhagen. She answered quietly in her room, not wanting to disturb the pre-breakfast stillness that had become precious to her. "Elena, I'm sorry to bother you, but we have a situation with the Henderson Group. They're threatening to terminate their contract unless we provide immediate strategic direction on their market expansion. They say our previous recommendations were too theoretical and demand something more actionable." Elena felt her stomach tighten as she listened to Marcus describe the client's complaints. The Henderson Group had been one of her most prestigious accounts, a manufacturing company seeking to expand into Southeast Asian markets. She'd spent months developing a comprehensive analysis of regulatory frameworks, cultural considerations, and competitive landscapes. Now, they were calling it theoretical? What exactly are they saying is wrong with the analysis? She asked, though part of her already knew the answer. They want concrete action steps, not just market insights. They feel like we gave them a beautiful map, but no directions for actually getting anywhere. After ending the call, Elena sat on her bed, feeling the familiar weight of professional failure settling on her shoulders. But as she prepared to spiral into self-criticism, she caught herself. This was exactly the kind of situation Dr. Whitmore had been preparing them for, a moment when automatic interpretation could trap her in unproductive thought patterns. Instead of immediately accepting her initial frame, that this was evidence of her analytical approach being flawed, she paused and asked herself the question that had become a reflex over the past few days. What else could this mean? The question opened space she hadn't realized was there. Maybe the Henderson Group's frustration wasn't about the quality of her analysis, but about a mismatch between what they needed and what she provided. Maybe too theoretical didn't mean wrong, but meant not actionable to the level of detail they required. She reached for her journal and began writing. Original frame. My analysis was inadequate, proving that my approach is too academic and impractical. Alternative frames. The client needed implementation guidance, not just strategic analysis. There was a miscommunication about deliverable expectations. Their definition of actionable is different from mine. This is feedback about presentation style, not analytical quality. They're under pressure and need someone to blame for their own uncertainty. As she wrote, Elena felt her emotional state shift from defensive anxiety to curious engagement. The situation hadn't changed, but her relationship to it had transformed completely. At breakfast, she found Dr. Whitmore already seated with his usual morning coffee and newspaper, looking like someone who had been awake for hours thinking productive thoughts. "You look different this morning," he observed as she joined him at the table. Something shifted. Elena told him about the Henderson Group call and her experiment with reframing. "It's remarkable how different the situation feels when I consider alternative interpretations instead of just accepting my first emotional reaction. What you've discovered is one of the most powerful tools for conscious thinking, the ability to separate events from your interpretation of events. Most people experience their interpretations as if they were reality itself." Sarah and Rachel arrived together, deep in conversation about a case study Rachel had been analyzing. They'd been working together increasingly often, their medical and financial backgrounds, creating an interesting synthesis of perspectives. "We were just discussing something related to what you and James are talking about," Sarah said, settling into her chair. "Rachel was showing me how the same market data can support completely different investment strategies depending on how you frame the underlying trends." Rachel nodded enthusiastically. "It's not that one interpretation is right and the others are wrong. It's that different frames highlight different aspects of the data. The frame determines what you notice and what you ignore." Andreas joined them looking unusually contemplative. "I overheard you mentioning reframing, and I have to say, it's been on my mind since yesterday's projection work. I keep thinking about my failed business partnerships and wondering how different they might have been if I'd been able to see them through multiple frames instead of just my default they don't understand innovation interpretation." Dr. Whitmore leaned back in his chair. "What you're all touching on is a recognition that meaning isn't inherent in events. It's constructed through interpretation. And since interpretation is a choice, we can learn to choose more consciously." He stood and walked to their familiar whiteboard, drawing a simple equation. Event plus interpretation equals experience. Most of us live unconsciously at the level of experience, assuming that our emotional reactions are direct responses to external events. But there's always an intermediate step, the frame or interpretation through which we understand what's happening. Elena thought about her initial reaction to the Henderson Group feedback, the immediate jump to self-criticism and professional anxiety. "So when I felt like a failure after Marcus's call, I wasn't responding to the objective facts of the situation, but to my interpretation of what those facts meant." Precisely. And once you recognize that interpretation is happening, you can begin to choose it consciously. Elena, what would it look like to approach the Henderson situation from the frame of "this is valuable feedback about client communication," rather than "this is evidence of my professional inadequacy"? Elena considered the question. "I would call them back and ask specifically what kind of actionable guidance they need. I would treat their frustration as information about their actual requirements rather than as criticism of my analytical approach." And how would that feel different? Collaborative instead of defensive. Curious instead of ashamed. Like I'm solving a problem with them rather than defending myself against their judgment. Rachel was taking notes rapidly. This is like changing the algorithm that processes market data. The data stays the same, but what you extract from it changes completely based on the analytical framework you apply. Dr. Whitmore nodded. "But here's the subtle part. Reframing isn't about positive thinking or denying difficult realities. It's about conscious meaning-making. Sometimes the most empowering frame is actually the most challenging one." He drew another diagram showing multiple arrows pointing from a single event toward different interpretation boxes. "Andreas, can you think of a professional setback that you initially interpreted as failure, but might be reframed as necessary preparation for something better?" Andreas was quiet for a long moment. "The startup that failed 2 years ago. I framed it as evidence that my innovation methodology was flawed. But what if I reframed it as necessary learning about the difference between theoretical innovation and practical implementation? And how would that reframe change your current approach to consulting? I would seek out implementation challenges instead of avoiding them. I would partner with people who have operational expertise instead of seeing them as intellectually inferior. I would treat practical constraints as design parameters rather than obstacles to creativity. Sarah leaned forward. In medicine, we do something similar with patient outcomes. Instead of framing every poor outcome as a failure, we can frame it as important data about treatment effectiveness. The emotional impact is completely different, and the learning is deeper. Dr. Whitmore turned back to the group. This morning, I want you to practice what we call perspective multiplication, the deliberate generation of multiple interpretations for the same event. We'll start with professional situations, then expand to more personal territory. He handed them each a worksheet with a structured reframing exercise. Think of a recent professional disappointment or conflict. First, write down your automatic interpretation, the story your mind immediately tells about what happened. Then, challenge yourself to generate at least 4 alternative interpretations of the same events. Elena immediately returned to the Henderson Group situation, but this time approached it systematically. Event. Client complained that strategic analysis was too theoretical and demanded more actionable guidance. Automatic interpretation. My analytical approach is inadequate and impractical. Alternative interpretations. 1. Client communication gap. They needed implementation planning, not just strategic analysis. 2. Scope creep. They're asking for deliverables beyond what was originally contracted. 3. Internal pressure. They need someone to blame for their own strategic uncertainty. 4. Success indicator. The analysis was so compelling, they now want help implementing it. 5. Learning opportunity. This feedback reveals a service gap I could fill. As she wrote, Elena realized that several of the alternative interpretations actually position the situation as a business opportunity rather than professional failure. The same facts that had triggered shame and defensiveness could just as easily be interpreted as market intelligence about client needs. Andreas was working through his most recent client conflict, a disagreement about innovation priorities that led to him being replaced by a more traditional strategy consultant. Automatic interpretation. The client didn't understand true innovation and chose conventional thinking over breakthrough approaches. Alternative interpretations. 1. Timing mismatch. They needed operational optimization before breakthrough innovation. 2. Communication failure. I didn't translate innovation concepts into business language they could use. 3. Risk tolerance. They needed incremental progress more than revolutionary change. 4. Complementary expertise. They needed someone who could bridge innovation with implementation. 5. Market feedback. There's demand for innovation approaches that integrate with existing operations. This is extraordinary, he said, looking up from his worksheet. Every alternative interpretation suggests specific ways I could improve my consulting approach. The automatic interpretation just made me defensive and dismissive of their feedback. Rachel was analyzing a recent clash with a colleague who had challenged her quantitative models. My automatic interpretation was that he was being anti-intellectual and didn't understand sophisticated analysis. But when I generate alternatives, I see that he might have been pointing out genuine limitations in my approach, or highlighting qualitative factors I was missing, or simply advocating for approaches that better match their organizational culture. Sarah had chosen to examine a recent conflict with hospital administrators over diagnostic protocols. I automatically interpreted their cost concerns as interference with medical judgment. But alternative frames include, they're trying to balance patient care with resource allocation. They're responding to regulatory pressures I don't see. They have information about system-wide impacts that I lack, or they're trying to develop sustainable practices for long-term patient benefit. As they shared their reframing exercises, Elena noticed how each alternative interpretation opened different possibilities for action. The automatic interpretations tended to close down options, making the other party wrong or themselves inadequate. The alternative interpretations created space for collaboration, learning, and creative problem-solving. What you're discovering, Dr. Whitmore observed, is that reframing isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's a practical tool for expanding your response options. When you have only one interpretation of a situation, you have limited choices about how to respond. When you have multiple interpretations, you have multiple pathways forward. Elena raised her hand. But how do you choose which interpretation to act on? If multiple frames are all valid, How do you decide which one is most useful? That's the right question. The goal isn't to find the true interpretation. It's to choose the interpretation that serves your highest values and opens the most constructive possibilities. He drew a decision tree on the whiteboard showing how different interpretations led to different action options. Elena, looking at your Henderson Group alternatives, which interpretation would lead to actions most aligned with your professional values? Elena studied her list. The learning opportunity frame and the service gap frame both align with my values of continuous improvement and client service. They would lead me to have a collaborative conversation with Henderson about what additional support they need. And Andreas? The communication failure and timing mismatch frames align with my values of innovation that actually helps organizations. They would lead me to develop better ways of translating innovative concepts into practical implementation steps. Dr. Whitmore nodded. Notice how the reframing process naturally guides you toward actions that serve both your values and the relationship. This isn't about manipulating your perception to feel better. It's about conscious meaning-making that enables more skillful responses. After the morning session, Elena found herself walking in the Institute's gardens with Sarah, discussing the practical challenges of maintaining multiple perspectives in high-pressure professional situations. The hardest part for me, Sarah said, is that reframing takes time, and medical decisions often need to be made quickly. How do you practice perspective multiplication when there's no time for extended reflection? Elena had been wondering the same thing. I think maybe it's like developing any skill. You practice it in low-stakes situations until it becomes more automatic. Eventually, generating alternative interpretations might become as natural as generating initial interpretations. Like building new neural pathways? Exactly. The more you practice conscious meaning-making, the more options your brain generates automatically. They paused at a bench overlooking a small vegetable garden where late-season crops were being harvested. Elena found herself thinking about growth in seasons, about how the same soil could produce completely different crops depending on what seeds were planted and how they were tended. Sarah, can I share something that might sound strange? Of course. I'm starting to realize that my interpretation habits are like crops I've been growing unconsciously. I've been planting seeds of self-criticism and defensive analysis without realizing there were other seeds I could choose. Sarah smiled. That's a beautiful metaphor, and it suggests that changing interpretation patterns isn't just about thinking differently. It's about cultivating different mental habits over time. Right. Like tending a garden requires consistent attention, not just occasional insights. That evening, Elena wrote in her journal, "Today I learned that events don't have inherent meaning. I create their meaning through interpretation. This isn't relativism or positive thinking. It's conscious responsibility for the stories I tell about what happens to me." The Henderson Group situation shifted completely when I moved from automatic interpretation, I failed, to conscious meaning-making. This is feedback about client needs. Same facts, completely different possibility for action, but the deeper insight is about choice. I can choose interpretations that align with my values and open constructive possibilities, rather than defaulting to interpretations that make me defensive or powerless. Tomorrow, if I can reframe events, can I also reframe my professional identity? What stories have I been telling about who I am that might be limiting who I could become? Outside her window, the English countryside was settling into another evening. The same landscape she'd been watching for nearly a week, but somehow different each day as the light changed and her perspective shifted. Elena was beginning to understand that her professional life might be similarly stable and changeable, the same fundamental skills and experience, but capable of being framed in ways that open entirely different possibilities. The art of reframing wasn't about escaping reality. It was about taking creative responsibility for the reality she constructed through interpretation. Chapter 8, Breaking the Loop. The 7th morning at Thornfield arrived with a peculiar stillness, as if the English countryside itself was holding its breath. Elena woke before dawn with her mind already spinning. Not the productive analytical thinking she was used to, but a circular, obsessive replay of the Henderson Group situation. Despite yesterday's reframing exercise, her mind had spent the night cycling through variations of the same thoughts. What if the client fires us? What if word spreads that my analysis is too theoretical? What if this damages my reputation permanently? The thoughts weren't leading anywhere constructive, just wearing deeper grooves of anxiety in her consciousness. She recognized what Dr. Whitmore would call a thought loop, the mental equivalent of a hamster wheel, all motion and no progress. But recognizing it and escaping it were proving to be different skills entirely. Elena forced herself out of bed and into the shower, hoping the physical ritual would interrupt the mental spiral. Instead, the automatic nature of washing and dressing only provided more space for the loop to continue. By the time she reached the dining room, she felt exhausted despite having slept 7 hours. She found Andreas already at their usual table, staring into a cup of coffee with a 1,000-yard stare of someone trapped in his own recursive thinking. He looked up when she approached, and she saw in his expression a mirror of her own mental state. "Rough night?" she asked, settling into her chair. 3 hours analyzing my phone call with that client yesterday. Every possible thing I could have said differently, every way the conversation might have gone wrong, every implication for my consulting practice. He rubbed his temples. "I know it's unproductive, but I can't seem to stop. I've been doing the same thing with Henderson Group. Around, same thoughts, same anxiety, same dead ends." Sarah and Rachel joined them looking unusually subdued. The energy that had characterized their previous mornings, curiosity, engagement, intellectual excitement, was replaced by a kind of mental fatigue. "Let me guess," Sarah said, pouring herself coffee with mechanical precision. "Overthinking something that happened yesterday?" Rachel nodded grimly. "I've been mentally replaying every interaction I've had with my team over the past month, analyzing whether my mathematical modeling obsession has damaged my professional relationships. Same analysis, over and over, no new insights." Dr. Whitmore arrived carrying a stack of books and wearing the expression of someone who had anticipated exactly the scenario. "Ah," he said, surveying their faces, "you've encountered the loop trap." Elena looked up from her coffee. "The what?" "The phenomenon where increased self-awareness initially makes you more conscious of your thinking patterns, but doesn't immediately give you tools for interrupting them. So you become aware that you're overthinking, which gives you something new to overthink." Andreas laughed bitterly. "That's exactly what happened. I kept thinking, I'm overthinking this. I should stop overthinking this. But why can't I stop overthinking this? It's like being trapped in a hall of mirrors," Rachel added. Thinking about thinking, with no exit in sight." Dr. Whitmore set his books on the table and pulled up his chair. "What you're experiencing is actually a crucial stage in developing cognitive mastery. You've developed the ability to observe your thought patterns, but you haven't yet developed the ability to interrupt them. Today, we're going to learn how to step off the hamster wheel." He opened one of his books to a page marked with several bookmarks. "The key insight is this. You cannot think your way out of the thought loop. Trying to solve overthinking with more thinking is like trying to escape quicksand by struggling harder." Elena felt a flutter of recognition. "So how do you escape?" "By understanding that thoughts are not commands. They're just mental events, no different from sounds you hear or sensations you feel. The problem isn't having repetitive thoughts. The problem is believing you have to obey them, respond to them, or solve them." He drew a simple diagram on their whiteboard, a stick figure with thought bubbles above its head, some connected to the figure with solid lines labeled identification, and others connected with dotted lines labeled observation. Most people live in a state of thought identification. They experience themselves as their thoughts. When a worried thought arises, they become worried. When a critical thought appears, they become self-critical. But there's another possibility, thought observation. You can notice the thought without becoming it. Sarah leaned forward with professional interest. "This sounds similar to mindfulness techniques we sometimes teach patients for managing chronic pain. The pain doesn't disappear, but the relationship to the pain changes." "Exactly. Elena, when you were lie awake cycling through Henderson Group scenarios, what would have happened if you had treated those thoughts like background noise, acknowledged them but not engaged with them?" Elena tried to imagine it. "I suppose they might have continued for a while, but without my active participation, they would have eventually dissolved?" "Quite possibly. The fuel that keeps thought loops alive is your engagement with them. When you try to solve the obsessive thought, analyze it, or argue with it, you're feeding it attention. Attention is the oxygen that keeps mental loops burning. Andreas was taking notes. But how do you not engage? When a thought says, "What if this ruins your reputation?" it feels urgent, like something I need to address. That's the illusion of mental urgency. The thought feels urgent because it's connected to your survival instincts, the ancient part of your brain that's always scanning for threats. But most professional worries aren't actually urgent in any practical sense. They're just familiar mental patterns triggered by uncertainty. Dr. Whitmore stood and walked to the center of their circle. Let's try an exercise in real-time loop interruption. I want you to bring to mind the thought pattern that kept you awake last night. Really let yourself feel it, see it, experience a familiar spiral. Elena closed her eyes and immediately felt her mind reaching for the Henderson Group loop. What if they fire us? What if this damages my reputation? What if I'm not as good as I thought I was? Now, Dr. Whitmore continued, instead of trying to answer those questions or solve those concerns, I want you to simply notice that thinking is happening. Like watching clouds pass across the sky. Just observe the mental activity without getting caught up in the content. Elena tried to step back from the thoughts, to see them as mental events rather than urgent problems requiring solutions. It was surprisingly difficult. The thoughts had a gravitational pull, constantly trying to draw her back into engagement. I am having a thought that Henderson Group might fire us, she said aloud, experimenting with the distance that language created. Beautiful, Dr. Whitmore said. Notice the difference between Henderson Group might fire us and I am having the thought that Henderson Group might fire us. The first feels like reality. The second feels like mental activity. Andreas tried the same approach. I am having the thought that my client conversation yesterday was a professional disaster. He paused, looking surprised. That does feel different. Less urgent, more optional. Rachel experimented with her own loop. I am having the thought that my quantitative obsession has damaged my professional relationships. She opened her eyes. It's still uncomfortable, but it doesn't feel like something I have to solve right now. Dr. Whitmore returned to his seat. What you're practicing is called cognitive diffusion, the ability to see thoughts as mental events rather than as reality itself. But there's another tool that's even more powerful for interrupting loops: physical interruption. He demonstrated by standing abruptly, walking to the window, and taking 3 deep breaths while looking out at the gardens. Thought loops exist in mental space, but you exist in physical space. When you change your physical state deliberately, you can interrupt the mental pattern. Elena found this intriguing. So if I notice I'm looping, I could stand up, walk around, focus on physical sensations? Exactly. Or you could do jumping jacks, splash cold water on your face, hold an ice cube, or any physical action that brings you fully into present moment awareness. The key is making the physical intervention deliberate and immediate before the loop regains momentum. Sarah was nodding. In surgery, when I find myself second-guessing a decision, I sometimes pause and feel my feet on the floor, or deliberately slow my breathing. It creates space between the doubt and the action. That's perfect. You're interrupting the mental pattern by engaging a different system, the sensory-physical system, rather than the cognitive-analytical system. Dr. Whitmore pulled out a timer. Let's practice this in real time. I'm going to ask you to deliberately trigger your loop thoughts, then use physical interruption to break the pattern. Elena, think about Henderson Group for 30 seconds. Really let the worry spiral build. Elena closed her eyes and immediately felt her mind reaching for the familiar groove of anxiety. What if they terminate the contract? What if other clients hear about this? What if? Now stand up and focus entirely on physical sensations. What do you feel in your body right now? Elena stood abruptly, surprised by how immediately her mental state shifted. My feet on the floor, cool air on my skin, tension in my shoulders that I hadn't noticed. The Henderson Group thoughts were still there, but they felt distant, like voices from another room. Excellent. Andreas, your turn. They practiced a technique for 20 minutes, each taking turns deliberately entering their thought loops and then using physical interruption to break free. Elena was amazed by how effective the method was. not at eliminating the thoughts entirely, but at breaking their compulsive quality. The goal, Dr. Whitmore explained, isn't to never have repetitive thoughts. It's to have a choice about whether to engage with them. When you can step off the hamster wheel at will, the will loses its power over you. Rachel raised her hand. But what about productive analysis? How do you distinguish between useful reflection and unproductive looping? Brilliant question. Useful reflection moves forward. It generates new insights, clarifies options, or leads to specific actions. Unproductive looping moves in circles. It rehashes the same concerns without progress. If you've been thinking about something for more than 20 minutes without new insights or action steps, you're probably looping. Elena thought about her Henderson group thoughts. So when I've been worrying about their reaction for hours without taking any constructive action, like calling them to clarify their needs, that's looping, not analysis. Precisely. And once you recognize looping, the most productive response is usually physical interruption followed by specific action. What's one concrete step you could take regarding Henderson Group? Elena felt her mind shift from circular worry to linear problem solving. I could call them this afternoon and schedule a conversation about exactly what kind of actionable guidance they need. I could treat their feedback as valuable market research rather than personal criticism. Notice how different that feels from the loop thoughts. Completely different. It feels like forward movement instead of mental spinning. Andreas was experimenting with applying the same principle to his client's situation. Instead of replaying yesterday's conversation endlessly, I could email the client today with a revised proposal that addresses their implementation concerns. And I, Rachel said, could schedule individual meetings with my team members to get direct feedback about our working relationship instead of imagining worst-case scenarios. Dr. Whitmore smiled. What you're discovering is that most thought loops are actually avoidance mechanisms. They give you the illusion of working on a problem while allowing you to postpone taking real action. The insight hit Elena with surprising force. Her hours of Henderson Group worry had been a way of avoiding the vulnerability of actually calling them and having a direct conversation about their needs. The looping felt productive because it was mental activity, but it was actually sophisticated procrastination. So, interrupting loops isn't just about mental hygiene, she said. It's about moving from psychological activity to practical action. Exactly. And here's the beautiful paradox. Once you take concrete action, even small action, the mental loops often dissolve naturally. They were maintained by the tension between wanting to address the situation and being afraid to address it directly. As the morning session concluded, Elena felt a lightness she hadn't experienced since arriving at Thornfield, not because her professional challenges had disappeared, but because she'd learned to relate to mental activity differently. Thoughts were no longer commands she had to obey or problems she had to solve. They were simply mental weather passing through the sky of consciousness. During their afternoon walk, she found herself in conversation with Sarah about the practical applications of loop interruption in high-pressure professional environments. The challenge for me, Sarah said, is that medical decisions often require sustained analytical thinking. How do you distinguish between necessary deliberation and unproductive looping when lives are at stake? Elena had been wondering about something similar. I think maybe the key is the quality of the thinking. When I'm doing genuine analysis, I feel engaged and curious. When I'm looping, I feel anxious and trapped. That's a good distinction. Productive thinking feels expansive. It opens possibilities and clarifies options. Loop thinking feels contractive. It narrows focus to the same concerns without resolution. They walked in comfortable silence for a moment, both processing the morning's insights. Elena found herself noticing physical details she'd missed during her previous days of mental preoccupation. The particular way afternoon light filtered through oak leaves, the sound of gravel under their feet, the scent of late-blooming roses. Sarah, can I share something I'm realizing? Of course. I think I've been addicted to thinking, not just professional analysis, but mental activity itself. Like I believed that as long as my mind was busy, I was being productive. But most of that mental activity was just mental junk food. Sarah nodded. I recognize that pattern. It's like staying physically busy to avoid dealing with emotional issues. except at staying mentally busy to avoid dealing with practical uncertainties. Right. The looping gives me the feeling of working on my problems without the risk of actually confronting them. As they returned to the main house, Elena felt a shift in her relationship to her own mind. Instead of being at the mercy of whatever thoughts arose, she was developing the ability to choose which thoughts deserved her attention and engagement. That evening, she wrote in her journal, "Today I learned that thoughts are not commands. They're mental events I can observe without obeying. The endless loops I've been trapped in weren't sophisticated analysis. They were sophisticated avoidance of direct action. But the deeper insight is about presence. When I can step off the hamster wheel of repetitive thinking, I become available to what's actually happening right now. I can see situations more clearly, feel my emotions more accurately, and take more effective action. The irony is that by thinking less, I can think better. By engaging less with mental loops, I have more mental energy for genuine creativity and problem solving. Tomorrow, if I can interrupt automatic thinking patterns, what becomes possible? What creative solutions emerge when my mind isn't trapped in familiar grooves?" Outside her window, the English countryside was settling into another peaceful evening. The landscape looked different now, not because it had changed, but because she was seeing it with present-moment awareness rather than through the filter of mental preoccupation. Elena was discovering that the most profound shift wasn't learning new ways to think, but learning when not to think, when to step out of mental activity entirely and into the spacious awareness that made truly fresh thinking possible. Chapter 9, Beyond the Persona. Elena's 8th morning at Thornfield began with an unexpected question from Dr. Whitmore that arrived with her breakfast on a handwritten note. "Who were you before you became an expert?" She stared at the words while sipping her coffee, feeling an odd sensation of vertigo. The question seemed simple, but as she tried to answer it, she realized she couldn't remember a time when her identity wasn't fundamentally tied to her intellectual capabilities. Even as a child, she'd been the smart one, the girl who could solve problems others couldn't, who could see patterns and connections that impressed adults. When had Elena the person become Elena the expert? And what, if anything, lay beneath that professional identity? The question followed her to the dining room, where she found her cohort members looking unusually subdued. Each was holding a similar note with what appeared to be equally unsettling questions. Andreas looked up from his. "Who would you be if you couldn't solve problems through innovation?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I honestly don't know. I've been the innovation guy for so long that I can't remember what I was interested in before I discovered I could help companies transform." Sarah was staring at her note with medical precision. "What would you value if you weren't saving lives?" It's like asking what color is the sky if there is no sky. My identity as a healer goes back to childhood, playing with dolls that were always patients, not babies. Rachel held up her note. "What matters to you beyond being right about patterns and predictions?" I've been data-driven since I learned to count. Even my emotional responses to relationships get filtered through analytical frameworks. Dr. Whitmore entered carrying his usual coffee and wearing the expression of someone who had deliberately unsettled his students for their own good. "Troubling questions?" he asked, settling into his chair. Elena nodded. "It's making me realize how completely my sense of self is wrapped up in my professional identity. I honestly don't know who I am outside of being a strategic consultant." That's a profound recognition. Most successful professionals experience what we call identity fusion, the complete merger of personal identity with professional competence. You become so identified with your expertise that you lose touch with the deeper self that existed before and will exist after your professional roles. Dr. Whitmore walked to a whiteboard and drew a series of concentric circles, labeling them from outside to inside. Professional role, expertise, personality, core self. Most people live their entire lives in the outer circles, especially the professional role. They think they are what they do, what they know, how they perform. But these are just layers of identity, like clothes you wear, not who you fundamentally are. Elena studied the diagram. "So you're saying there's a core self that exists independently of my analytical abilities, my strategic thinking, my professional achievements? What do you think?" The question made Elena uncomfortable. If she wasn't her expertise, wasn't her professional competence, then who was she? The possibility of an identity that didn't depend on performance felt both liberating and terrifying. I suppose, she began hesitantly, there must have been someone there before I developed all these professional capabilities, some essential self that was curious enough to develop them in the first place. Andreas leaned forward. But how do you access that core self? How do you know what is essential versus what's just accumulated professional conditioning? Dr. Whitmore smiled. That's exactly the right question. And the answer requires what might be the most challenging practice we've explored so far, the willingness to not know who you are. He drew another diagram, showing a figure with question marks in the center circle. Most people are terrified of identity uncertainty. They'd rather cling to a false self that feels solid than explore an authentic self that feels unknown. But genuine self-discovery requires what we call identity courage, the willingness to release your attachment to who you think you are in order to discover who you actually are. Sarah was taking notes with her characteristic precision. In medicine, we sometimes have to destroy diseased tissue to save healthy tissue. Are you suggesting something similar with identity? Not destruction, more like archaeological excavation. We're not eliminating your professional competence, but digging beneath it to discover what it's built on. Your expertise is real and valuable, but it's not the foundation. It's what you constructed on top of the foundation. Elena felt a flutter of anxiety. But if my professional identity isn't the foundation, what happens to my career? How do I present myself to clients? How do I maintain credibility? Dr. Whitmore's expression grew gentle. Elena, what do you think would happen if clients encountered someone whose professional expertise emerged from authentic self-knowledge rather than from identity fusion? She considered the question. I suppose they might trust them more? Someone who knows both their capabilities and their limits. Who can access their expertise without being trapped inside it? And how would that person respond to professional challenges or failures? More resiliently, maybe, if their identity isn't completely tied to professional success, they could learn from setbacks without their whole sense of self collapsing. Rachel looked up from her own reflections. It's like the difference between a tree whose roots are deep and one whose roots are shallow. The deep-rooted tree can weather storms that would topple the other one. Dr. Whitmore nodded. Beautiful analogy. Your professional identity is like the visible part of the tree, the trunk, branches, leaves. But what makes it stable and resilient are the roots you can't see, the core self that exists independently of professional performance. He handed them each a new worksheet. This morning, we're going to practice what I call identity archaeology, exploring the layers of who you are to discover what remains when you strip away all the professional conditioning. Elena looked at the worksheet, which contained a series of increasingly fundamental questions. What aspects of your personality existed before you developed professional expertise? What did you care about as a child before career considerations? What do you value that has nothing to do with professional achievement? What would you still find meaningful if your career ended tomorrow? Who are you when no one is evaluating your performance? The questions felt like an invitation to explore territory she'd been avoiding for decades. Elena began writing hesitantly. Before I became a strategic consultant, I was curious, deeply curious about how things worked, how people made decisions, how complex systems held together or fell apart. The analytical skills came later, but the curiosity was always there. As a child, I cared about fairness. I was always the one trying to mediate playground disputes, trying to figure out solutions where everyone could win. I loved puzzles, but not for their own sake. I loved the moment when complexity resolved into clarity. I value understanding, not being right exactly, but truly comprehending what's really happening in complex situations. When I help a client see their business more clearly, the satisfaction isn't about demonstrating my cleverness. It's about creating genuine insight. As she wrote, Elena felt something shifting in her understanding of herself. The core self that was emerging felt more fundamental than her professional identity, but also more integrated with it. Her expertise wasn't separate from who she was. It was an expression of who she was. Andreas was having a similar revelation. I'm realizing that my fascination with innovation isn't just professional. It goes back to childhood curiosity about how things could be different. I used to spend hours imagining alternative versions of everything, from better playground equipment to different ways my family could organize dinner conversations. And what does that tell you about the relationship between your core self and your professional work? Dr. Whitmore asked. That the innovation consulting isn't separate from who I am. It's how my essential curiosity about possibility expresses itself in professional contexts. But the curiosity is deeper than the consulting methods. Sarah was nodding. I'm seeing something similar. My drive to heal people isn't just professional training. It's an expression of a fundamental compassion that was there long before I learned medical procedures. The surgical skills are tools for expressing something more essential. Rachel looked up from her writing. This is fascinating. I'm discovering that my analytical nature isn't just about being right. It's about a deep need to understand how things really work beneath surface appearances. The quantitative methods are expressions of that need, but the need itself is more fundamental. Dr. Whitmore walked around their circle, observing their work. What you're each discovering is that your professional expertise, when it's authentic, is actually an expression of your core self rather than a replacement for it. The problems arise when you confuse the expression with the essence. Elena felt a sudden clarity. So when I lost a Nordstrom client, it felt like such a catastrophic identity crisis, because I was completely identified with my analytical methods. I thought my worth as a person depended on the effectiveness of my professional techniques. Precisely. But if you understand that your analytical abilities are expressions of deeper curiosity and desire for clarity, then professional setbacks become information about methods, not judgments about your essential worth. Andreas leaned back in his chair. This explains why I've been so defensive about criticism of my innovation approaches. I wasn't just defending professional methods. I thought I was defending my core identity. And when your methods are criticized or fail, instead of experiencing existential threat, you can ask, how can I find better ways to express my essential creativity and curiosity about possibility? The shift felt profound to Elena. Instead of her identity depending on the success of her analytical framework, her framework became one possible expression of deeper values and capacities. If this particular approach didn't work, she could find others without experiencing fundamental self-doubt. Dr. Whitmore returned to whiteboard and drew arrows connecting the outer circles to the inner ones. When your professional expertise emerges from authentic self-knowledge, several things happen. First, you become more flexible. If one method doesn't work, you can find another without identity crisis. Second, you become more creative. You're not limited to expressing your essential self through familiar professional patterns. Third, Sarah added, you become more resilient. Professional failures don't threaten your core identity, so you can learn from them more readily. And fourth, Rachel said, you become more trustworthy to clients because you're not desperately trying to prove your worth through professional performance. You can acknowledge limitations and uncertainties without feeling like you're admitting fundamental inadequacy. Elena felt something settling into place, like a key turning in a lock she hadn't realized existed. It's the difference between performing expertise and embodying expertise. Beautiful distinction. When you perform expertise, you're always at risk of being found inadequate. When you embody expertise, when it emerges from authentic self-knowledge, there's nothing to defend because you're not hiding behind it. Dr. Whitmore walked back to his seat. This afternoon, I want you to experiment with what we call identity integration. Consciously accessing your core self while engaging in professional activities. Elena, you mentioned calling the Henderson Group client. How would that conversation be different if it came from your essential curiosity and desire for clarity rather than from defensive professional performance? Elena imagined the conversation from this different ground of being. I would be genuinely curious about what they need rather than defensive about what I provided. I would see their feedback as information about how to serve them better rather than as criticism of my fundamental competence. And how would that feel different? Collaborative instead of defensive, spacious instead of contracted, like I was solving a problem with them rather than protecting myself from them. Andreas was exploring his own application. If I approach client conversations from essential creativity rather than from defending my innovation methodology, I would be more interested in what actually serves their situation than in proving my approaches are correct. Sarah nodded. And I could approach challenging medical cases from fundamental compassion rather than from need to prove diagnostic competence. The question becomes, how can I best serve this patient? Rather than how can I avoid making mistakes that make me look incompetent? As the morning session concluded, Elena felt a lightness she hadn't experienced since arriving at Thornfield. Not the temporary relief of solving a problem, but the deeper ease of being more authentically herself. During their afternoon walk, she found herself in conversation with Andreas about the practical challenges of maintaining identity integration in demanding professional environments. The part that concerns me, he said, is that business culture seems to reward the kind of identity fusion we've been exploring. Clients want consultants who are completely confident, who never admit uncertainty, who embody their methodologies totally. Elena had been thinking about the same challenge. But what if that's changing? What if clients are actually hungry for advisors who can acknowledge complexity and uncertainty while still providing valuable guidance? You mean moving from the guru model of consulting to something more collaborative? Exactly. Instead of pretending to have all the answers, we could position ourselves as skilled guides through uncertainty, people who can help clients navigate complexity without claiming to eliminate it. They paused at their familiar bench, overlooking the pond where ducks continued their mysteriously coordinated dance. Elena found herself thinking about emergence again, the way complex systems could exhibit purposeful behavior without central control, the way authentic expertise might emerge in the integration of core self and learned skills. Andreas, can I share something I'm realizing? Of course. I think the reason I've been so attracted to analytical frameworks is that they give me a way to help people see complex situations more clearly. That's what I've always cared about, not being right, but helping create genuine understanding. That sounds like your core self expressing itself through professional capabilities. Right. And if I can remember that the clarity is what matters, not the specific analytical methods, then I can be more flexible about how I create that clarity for different clients in different situations. That evening, Elena wrote in her journal, "Today I discovered that I am not my expertise. My expertise is an expression of who I am. The core self that existed before professional training, and will exist after professional roles, is what gives my work authenticity and resilience. But this isn't about diminishing professional competence. It's about grounding it in something deeper and more flexible. When I know who I am beneath what I do, I can do what I do with more creativity, courage, and genuine service. The question is no longer, how can I defend my professional identity? But how can I most authentically express my core values through professional service? Tomorrow, if my expertise emerges from authentic self-knowledge, how does that change the way I engage with clients, colleagues, and complex problems?" Outside her window, the English countryside rested in its ancient patience, the same landscape that supported countless generations of people discovering and rediscovering who they were beneath who they thought they should be. Elena was beginning to understand that the journey toward expertise might actually be a journey toward increasingly authentic self-expression, not becoming someone else, but becoming more fully who she'd always been. Chapter 10, The Integration Test. Elena's ninth morning at Thornfield arrived with an urgent phone call from Marcus that shattered the contemplative quiet she'd grown accustomed to. She answered on the second ring, immediately sensing the tension in his voice despite the early hour. "Elena, we have a crisis. The Henderson Group isn't just complaining about the theoretical analysis anymore. They're threatening legal action. They claim our recommendations cause them to miss a critical market window, and they want compensation for lost opportunities." Elena felt her stomach drop, but noticed something different in her response. Instead of immediately spiraling into a familiar loop of self-blame and defensive analysis, she found herself pausing, breathing, observing the cascade of thoughts and emotions without being swept away by them. "Tell me exactly what they're claiming," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Marcus detailed the accusations. Henderson Group had delayed their Southeast Asian expansion while waiting for Elena's comprehensive market analysis, missing what they now claimed was an optimal entry period. A competitor had launched successfully in 3 key markets during those months, and Henderson was holding Meridian responsible for strategic delay. "The legal department wants to know if we have documentation showing that they approve the analytical approach," Marcus continued. "They're also asking about liability insurance and whether we should engage external counsel." As Elena listened, She practiced the cognitive skills she'd been developing. Instead of accepting her first interpretation, that this was evidence of her professional inadequacy, she consciously generated alternatives. Maybe Henderson was facing internal pressure and needed someone to blame. Maybe their risk tolerance had changed. Maybe this was a negotiation tactic to reduce their consulting fees. But more importantly, she noticed her emotional state. Fear was present, along with shame and defensive anger. But instead of being controlled by these emotions, she could observe them as information about her mental state rather than accurate assessments of external reality. "Marcus, I need to call you back in 30 minutes. There's something I need to do first." After ending the call, Elena walked quickly to the practice room, where she'd learned to interrupt thought loops. She stood by the tall windows overlooking the misty gardens and practiced the physical grounding technique that had become second nature over the past week. Feet on the floor, breath moving naturally, shoulders releasing tension she hadn't noticed accumulating. The familiar panic about professional reputation was still there, but it felt more like background noise than an emergency signal. From this more centered state, Elena could think about the Henderson situation with genuine clarity, rather than reactive defensiveness. What did she actually know? What assumptions was she making? What information did she need before drawing conclusions? She found Dr. Whitmore in the dining room, reading a morning newspaper and radiating the kind of calm presence that suggested he'd been expecting her. "Crisis call?" he asked without looking up from his reading. Elena described the Henderson Group situation, watching Dr. Whitmore's expression for signs of concern or judgment. Instead, she saw something approaching interest, as if this were a fascinating case study rather than a professional emergency. "And how are you responding to this information?" he asked. "Differently than I would have 2 weeks ago. Instead of immediately accepting that I'm at fault and spiraling into damage control mode, I'm trying to understand what's actually happening before deciding how to respond." "What do you think is actually happening?" Elena considered the question. "I think Henderson Group is facing pressure about their delayed expansion and is looking for someone to blame. But I also think there might be genuine miscommunication about what they needed from our engagement and what we provided. And how does it feel to hold both of those possibilities simultaneously? Uncomfortable, but spacious, like I have room to maneuver instead of being trapped in one interpretation." Dr. Whitmore folded his newspaper. "This sounds like an opportunity to practice everything you've been learning in a real-world context. What would integrated expertise look like in this situation?" Elena thought about her identity work from the previous day. "I would approach this from curiosity about what actually serves everyone involved, rather than from defensiveness about protecting my reputation. I would be honest about both what we provided and what they might have needed that we didn't provide. And what's the first step from that perspective? I need to have a direct conversation with Henderson Group leadership, not to defend our work or blame them for unrealistic expectations, but to understand what they actually needed and explore how we might address that." Dr. Whitmore smiled. "That sounds like an expression of your core values: clarity, fairness, genuine service, rather than reactive professional defense." Elena felt something settling into place. "You know what's interesting? I'm still concerned about the legal threats and potential reputation damage. But those concerns feel manageable now, like problems to be solved rather than evidence of existential failure." "What changed?" "My identity isn't completely tied to this one client outcome. I know who I am beneath what I do, so professional challenges don't threaten my fundamental sense of worth." Sarah and Andreas arrived at that moment, both looking curious about Elena's early morning intensity. "Real-world crisis management practice?" Sarah asked, settling into her usual chair. Elena described the Henderson situation, noting how different it felt to share professional challenges from a place of centered clarity rather than defensive anxiety. "What strikes me," Andrea said after hearing the details, "is that this could be an opportunity to practice the collaborative approach we've been discussing. Instead of treating Henderson as adversaries trying to damage you, you could treat them as partners trying to solve a business problem." Rachel joined them as Elena was explaining her planned approach. "This reminds me of debugging complex algorithms. Instead of defending the original code when it produces unexpected results, you examine what actually happened and what modifications might produce better outcomes." "Exactly," Elena said. And the key insight is that Henderson's dissatisfaction doesn't necessarily mean our analysis was wrong. It might mean it was incomplete or differently focused than what they actually needed. Dr. Whitmore leaned back in his chair. Elena, this afternoon you'll have a chance to test everything you've been learning. But first, let's use this situation to practice one more crucial skill: stakeholder perspective integration. He walked to their familiar whiteboard and drew several interconnected circles labeled with different perspectives: Elena/Meridian, Henderson Group, legal requirements, industry standards, future client relationships. Most professional crises become intractable because each party focuses only on their own perspective. But mature problem-solving requires the ability to see the situation through multiple lenses simultaneously. Elena studied the diagram. So instead of just focusing on protecting Meridian's interests, I need to understand what Henderson actually needs, what legal requirements we must meet, what industry standards apply, and how our response affects our broader professional relationships. And how does each perspective change your understanding of the situation? Elena worked through each lens systematically. From Henderson's perspective, they were facing internal pressure about delayed expansion and needed either successful results or someone to blame. From a legal standpoint, the issue was whether Meridian had fulfilled the contracted obligations. From an industry perspective, the question was about setting precedents for consultant liability. From a future client standpoint, how Meridian handled this crisis would signal their professionalism and integrity. This is remarkable, she said. Each perspective reveals different aspects of the situation and different solution possibilities. None of them alone captures the full complexity. Andreas was taking notes. It's like the blind people and elephant story again. Each stakeholder is touching a different part of the same reality. But here's the crucial insight, Dr. Whitmore said. When you can see through all the perspectives simultaneously, you can often find solutions that serve multiple stakeholder needs rather than forcing win-lose outcomes. Elena felt her strategic mind engaging, but from the grounded clarity she'd been developing rather than from reactive defensiveness. What if I approach Henderson not as adversaries to defeat, but as partners facing a business challenge that our engagement somehow didn't fully address? What would that look like practically? I could start by acknowledging that our analysis, while technically sound, apparently didn't provide the actionable guidance they needed for their specific timeline and risk tolerance. Then explore what additional support might help them succeed with their expansion, whether through modified recommendations, implementation guidance, or referrals to other specialists. Sarah leaned forward. That's brilliant. You're reframing from who's at fault to how can we create a successful outcome for everyone involved? Rachel nodded enthusiastically. And it demonstrates exactly the kind of mature expertise clients actually want. Someone who can acknowledge limitations while finding constructive ways forward. Elena felt a surge of excitement that had nothing to do with defending her reputation, and everything to do with the intellectual challenge of finding creative solutions to complex problems. This was the curiosity and desire for clarity that she'd identified as core aspects of her identity, expressing itself through professional problem-solving. There's one more element to consider, Dr. Whitmore said, adding another circle to his diagram labeled long-term learning. How can you use this situation to develop better methodologies for future engagements? Elena reflected on the lessons embedded in the Henderson crisis. I could develop better processes for clarifying client expectations about deliverable specificity, timelines, and actionability. I could create frameworks for checking in with clients during long analytical processes to ensure we're staying aligned with their evolving needs. So the crisis becomes a catalyst for professional development rather than just damage to be contained. Exactly. And that learning benefits all future clients, not just Henderson Group. As the morning session concluded, Elena felt a transformation in her relationship to professional challenges. Instead of threats to be defended against, they were opportunities for integrated thinking, stakeholder service, and continuous learning. She spent the lunch hour preparing for her afternoon call with Henderson Group, but the preparation felt completely different from her usual approach. Instead of building defensive arguments or marshaling evidence of her competence, she was designing a conversation that could serve everyone's interests while maintaining her professional integrity. At 2:00 Copenhagen time, Elena placed a call from Dr. Whitmore's office. with his permission to stay for observation and support. Henderson Group CEO, Margaret Lindqvist, answered with the crisp formality of someone expecting a difficult conversation. Ms. Reeves, I assume you're calling about our legal notification. Elena took a breath and accessed the centered clarity she'd been practicing. Ms. Lindqvist, I'm calling because I understand you're facing challenges with your Southeast Asian expansion timeline. I want to explore how we might address those constructively. There was a pause on the other end. I wasn't expecting that opening. I've been reflecting on our engagement, and I recognize that while our market analysis was comprehensive, it may not have provided the specific implementation guidance you needed for your decision timeline. I'd like to understand what would actually help you succeed with your expansion goals. What followed was the most productive client conversation Elena had experienced in years. Instead of defending positions, they explored Henderson's actual decision-making process, timeline pressures, and implementation challenges. Instead of blame and legal threats, the discussion focused on practical solutions and mutual learning. By the end of the 30-minute call, Elena had arranged to provide supplementary implementation guidance at no additional cost. Henderson had agreed to withdraw their legal threats, and both parties had identified improvements for future engagements. After ending the call, Elena sat in silence for a moment, processing what had just happened. How do you feel? Dr. Whitmore asked quietly. Different. Completely different. That conversation felt like genuine professional service rather than reputation management, and the result was better for everyone involved. What enabled that difference? Elena considered the question. Integration. I wasn't defending my professional identity. I was expressing my core values through professional problem solving. I wasn't reacting from emotional filters. I was responding from conscious choice about what actually serves the situation. Dr. Whitmore smiled. What you just experienced is what we call embodied expertise. The integration of technical competence with emotional intelligence, stakeholder awareness, and authentic self-expression. This is what becomes possible when you master your own thinking processes. That evening, Elena wrote in her journal, "Today I faced my first real-world test of everything I've been learning, and something remarkable happened. Instead of being controlled by my usual patterns of defensive reaction, I could choose my response consciously. The Henderson crisis became an opportunity to practice integrated thinking, seeing through multiple perspectives simultaneously, accessing technical competence without being trapped by professional identity, and finding solutions that serve everyone involved. But the deeper insight is about transformation. I'm not the same consultant who arrived here 9 days ago, not because I've learned new techniques, but because I've learned to think about thinking itself. I can observe my own cognitive processes and choose different responses. Tomorrow is our final day. The question isn't whether I can maintain these insights when I return to Copenhagen. It's how I can continue growing this capacity for conscious thought and service of increasingly complex challenges." Outside the window, the English countryside rested in its ancient wisdom, the same landscape that had supported countless transformations, countless journeys from unconscious competence to conscious mastery. Elena was ready to begin the real work, not just thinking critically about external problems, but thinking consciously about the thinking that shapes everything else. Chapter 11, The Return. Elena's final morning at Thornfield arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that often follows storms. She woke before dawn, not from anxiety or racing thoughts, as had become her pattern over recent years, but from a quiet alertness that felt like readiness rather than restlessness. Her suitcase lay open on the bed, partially packed with the same clothes she brought 10 days ago. But everything felt different now. Not just her relationship to her professional challenges, but her sense of who she was approaching them as. The woman preparing to return to Copenhagen carried the same credentials and experience as the one who had arrived, but she was no longer imprisoned by unconscious patterns of thought. She found Dr. Whitmore in the garden, walking among the late-blooming roses with the deliberate pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. The morning mist was lifting from the countryside, revealing layers of landscape that had been hidden in shadow. "Ready for the return journey?" he asked as she joined him on the gravel path. Elena considered the question. "I feel different about readiness itself. Before coming here, being ready meant having all the answers, feeling confident about my approach. Now readiness feels more like conscious uncertainty, being prepared to think freshly about whatever emerges. And how does that change your anticipation of returning to your professional life? I'm curious rather than anxious. Instead of worrying about whether I can maintain these insights under pressure, I'm wondering what new challenges will help me develop them further. They walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes. The only sounds are footsteps on gravel and the distant calling of birds. Elena found herself thinking about the metaphor of gardens, how growth required both careful tending and patience with natural rhythms. Dr. Whitmore, can I ask you something that's been on my mind? Of course. How do you maintain conscious thinking in environments that reward unconscious patterns? Most business cultures seem designed to trigger reactive thinking, deadline pressure, competitive dynamics, the demand for immediate certainty. Dr. Whitmore paused beside a bench they'd occupied many times over the past 10 days. That's perhaps the most important question you could ask. Because insight that can't survive contact with real-world pressures isn't insight, it's just temporary clarity. He settled onto the bench, and Elena joined him. What have you noticed about your own patterns of thinking over the past week? That conscious thinking becomes easier with practice. The first few days, I had to deliberately apply techniques like emotional labeling or perspective multiplication. Now, they're starting to feel more natural, more automatic. So you're developing new unconscious patterns, but these ones serve you rather than limiting you. Elena felt something click into place. So the goal isn't to eliminate all unconscious processing, but to train unconscious processes that support conscious choice rather than replacing it. Exactly. You're developing what we might call metacognitive habits, automatic ways of stepping back from automatic reactions. Eventually, questioning your assumptions, seeking disconfirming evidence, and generating multiple perspectives can become as natural as your old patterns of defensive thinking. But that requires consistent practice. Yes, and here's what I've learned from working with hundreds of professionals over the years. The ones who successfully integrate these skills are those who treat conscious thinking as an ongoing practice rather than a problem to be solved once and forgotten. Dr. Whitmore pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket and handed it to Elena. This is for you, not for taking notes about external problems, but for tracking your own thinking processes. The practice of observing and recording your cognitive patterns is one of the most powerful tools for continued development. Elena opened the notebook to find the first page already inscribed. The question is not whether your thinking is perfect, but whether it is conscious. Every week, Dr. Whitmore continued, spend 30 minutes reviewing your professional interactions through the lenses we've explored. When did you react automatically versus respond consciously? When did emotional filters color your perceptions? When did you project your own issues onto others? When did confirmation bias limit your information gathering? Elena found herself already imagining this practice, like a pilot reviewing flight logs to identify patterns and areas for improvement. Perfect analogy. And just as pilots don't review their logs to criticize their performance, but to enhance their skills, you'll be tracking your thinking patterns to develop them, not to judge them. Sarah, Andreas, and Rachel approached from the direction of the main house, all carrying their luggage and wearing expressions that mixed gratitude with apprehension about returning to their regular professional lives. The final gathering, Sarah said, settling onto the grass beside their bench with the easy informality that had developed among them over the past week. Elena looked around at her cohort members, these 3 people who had witnessed her cognitive vulnerabilities and supported her intellectual growth. I'm going to miss this. The safety of being able to examine our thinking patterns without professional consequences. Andreas nodded. But maybe we can create that safety for others. I keep thinking about how different my client relationships could be if I approached them with the kind of honest curiosity we developed here. Speaking of which, Rachel said, pulling out her phone, I'd like to propose something. What if we committed to staying in touch? Not just socially, but as thinking partners. We could schedule monthly calls to review our cognitive patterns, challenge each other's assumptions, and support continued development. Elena felt a surge of enthusiasm for the idea, like a peer supervision group for conscious thinking. Exactly, because I suspect the biggest risk isn't forgetting what we've learned, but gradually sliding back into unconscious patterns without realizing it. Dr. Whitmore smiled approvingly. That's a wise recognition. Consciousness requires community. It's very difficult to maintain awareness of your own blind spots without others who can see what you cannot. As they discussed the logistics of their ongoing collaboration, Elena reflected on how different this conversation felt from typical professional networking. Instead of positioning themselves competitively or trying to extract value from each other, they were genuinely exploring how to support mutual growth. "There's something else I want to propose," Elena said. "What if we each committed to sharing these approaches with our colleagues and clients? Not in a preachy way, but by modeling conscious thinking and inviting others into more reflective conversations." Sarah leaned forward with interest, like being ambassadors for the kind of professional culture we want to work in. Yes, instead of just adapting to organizational cultures that reward reactive thinking, we could influence those cultures toward more conscious decision-making. Andreas was nodding enthusiastically. "I'm imagining client meetings where I actually acknowledge the limitations of my recommendations, where I explore multiple perspectives on our challenges, where I treat uncertainty as information rather than weakness. And I could model the kind of medical thinking that integrates technical expertise with emotional intelligence and stakeholder awareness," Sarah added. Rachel looked thoughtful. "It's interesting. What we're describing isn't just individual skill development. It's a vision for a transforming professional culture itself." Dr. Whitmore stood and walked to the edge of the garden, looking out over the countryside that had provided the backdrop for their learning. "What you're recognizing is that conscious thinking is ultimately not just a personal practice. It's a social practice. The quality of our individual thinking shapes the quality of our relationships, our organizations, and our broader culture." Elena joined him at the garden's edge, feeling the weight and possibility of that insight. So, developing conscious thinking becomes a form of service, not just to our own effectiveness, but to the quality of collective decision-making. And that, Dr. Whitmore said, transforms the entire motivation for this work. Instead of developing thinking skills to gain competitive advantage, you're developing them to contribute to wiser, more collaborative problem-solving. As they prepared to leave for their respective journeys home, Elena felt a shift in how she understood the relationship between personal development and professional service. The insights she gained weren't possessions to be hoarded, but tools to be shared, not just for individual success, but for collective flourishing. The train ride back to London gave Elena time to synthesize her experience and plan her re-entry into professional life. Instead of the usual anxiety about catching up on miscommunications and delayed projects, she found herself genuinely curious about how her expanded awareness would change her engagement with familiar challenges. She opened the notebook Dr. Whitmore had given her and began writing. Integration commitments. 1. Daily practice. Spend 10 minutes each morning reviewing the previous day's interactions through the lens of conscious versus reactive thinking. What patterns do I notice? What triggered automatic responses? How might I choose differently? 2. Weekly review. Use 30 minutes each Friday to examine the week's major decisions and conversations. Did I seek disconfirming evidence? Did I consider multiple stakeholder perspectives? Did I respond from core values or defensive patterns? 3. Monthly peer learning. Video calls with Andreas, Sarah, and Rachel to share cognitive insights, challenge each other's assumptions, and support continued development. 4. Client integration. Gradually introduce clients to more conscious analytical approaches. Acknowledge limitations of recommendations. Explore multiple perspectives on their challenges. Model intellectual humility. 5. Organizational influence. Look for opportunities to promote conscious thinking in team meetings, strategic planning, and professional development initiatives. As the train pulled into London's Paddington Station, Elena realized that her learning had come full circle. She'd begun this journey because her unconscious expertise had led to professional failure. Now she was returning with conscious expertise that felt more resilient, more creative, and more genuinely useful to others. The flight to Copenhagen provided additional time for reflection. Looking down at the North Sea from 30,000 feet, Elena thought about perspective, how distance could provide clarity, how shifting viewpoints could reveal aspects of reality that were invisible from ground level. But the most important perspective shift, she realized, was internal. Instead of seeing her professional challenges from the anxious viewpoint of someone whose identity depended on performance, She could now see them from the curious viewpoint of someone whose identity was grounded in values deeper than professional success. Marcus met her at Copenhagen airport, looking both eager and apprehensive about her transformation. As they drove the familiar streets toward Meridian's offices, Elena found herself seeing her professional environment with new eyes. "So how do you feel?" Marcus asked as they navigated evening traffic. "Ready to get back to normal?" Elena smiled. "I'm not sure I want to get back to normal. I want to get to something better than normal, something more conscious." She told him about the Henderson Group resolution, about the insight she'd gained about identity and projection, about her plans for integrating conscious thinking into their consulting practice. "The thing is, Marcus, I think our clients are hungry for this approach even if they don't know how to ask for it. They're tired of consultants who pretend to have all the answers. They want advisors who can navigate uncertainty skillfully rather than claiming to eliminate it." Marcus looked thoughtful as they pulled into Meridian's parking garage. "You know what? I think you might be right. Some of our most successful client relationships have been the ones where we acknowledged what we didn't know and explored solutions collaboratively." That evening, alone in her Copenhagen apartment for the first time in 10 days, Elena felt the space differently. The familiar surroundings, her carefully chosen furniture, her wall of business books, her view of the Øresund remained the same, but her relationship to them had shifted. Instead of feeling like props and performance of professional success, they felt like elements of a life being consciously constructed according to values she was still discovering. She opened her journal one final time before bed and wrote, "Today I returned to Copenhagen, but I'm not the same person who left 10 days ago. Not because I've learned new techniques or acquired new knowledge, but because I've learned to think about thinking itself. The real transformation isn't in what I know, but in how I hold what I know. My expertise is no longer a fortress protecting my identity. It's a tool for serving clarity and understanding in service of problems larger than myself. Tomorrow I begin the real work, practicing conscious thinking not in the safety of a learning environment, but in the complex pressures of professional life. The question isn't whether I can maintain these insights perfectly, but whether I can continue developing them through engagement with real challenges. The journey toward conscious thinking, I'm beginning to understand, doesn't end with insight. It begins there, outside her window. Copenhagen sparkled in the darkness, ancient and modern intertwined. Each light representing someone navigating their own complex relationship with knowledge, certainty, and the endless human project of trying to think clearly about thinking itself. Elena turned off the light and settled into sleep, carried not by the old anxiety about tomorrow's challenges, but by curiosity about what conscious engagement with those challenges might reveal. The real adventure was just beginning. Epilogue. 6 months later. The morning light streaming through Elena's office windows carried the crisp promise of a Copenhagen spring. She sat across from David Anderson, CEO of Nordic Renewable Energy, watching him wrestle with a decision that could define his company's next decade. The familiar weight of client expectation filled the air, that particular pressure that came when someone desperately wanted certainty in an uncertain world. "So, what's your recommendation, Elena? Wind or solar? We need to commit to one technology platform for our next expansion phase." 6 months ago, Elena would have felt a familiar tug of professional performance anxiety. The client wanted an answer, and her reputation depended on providing one that appeared confident and definitive. She would have analyzed the data through her preferred frameworks, found the option that best fit her existing models, and presented it with the kind of certainty that clients seemed to crave. Now, she found herself genuinely curious about what lay beneath David's either-or framing of question. "David, can I ask you something? What's making this feel like a choice between wind and solar, rather than a question about how to build the most resilient renewable energy portfolio?" David paused, his expression shifting from expectation to reflection. "I hadn't thought about it that way. Our board has been pushing for strategic focus, for picking one technology and dominating it. And what assumptions are embedded in that board directive?" Elena watched David's face as he processed the question. Over the past 6 months, she'd learned that the most valuable thing she could offer clients wasn't answers, but better questions. Questions that helped them examine their own thinking patterns rather than simply accepting her analytical frameworks. "I suppose they're assuming that focus automatically creates competitive advantage, and that diversification necessarily creates weakness. David leaned back in his chair. But now that I say out loud, I'm not sure that assumption holds in the renewable energy market. Elena smiled, feeling the familiar satisfaction that came not from being right, but from helping someone see their situation more clearly. What if we explored both the focus strategy and the diversification strategy? What would each approach optimize for? What risks would each create? What assumptions would we need to validate? As they worked through multiple scenarios over the next hour, Elena found herself drawing on all the cognitive skills she developed at Thornfield. She noticed her emotional reactions to different strategic options and used them as information rather than imperatives. When David expressed frustration with the complexity, she helped him examine whether his desire for simplicity was serving strategic clarity or avoiding difficult decisions. Most importantly, she remained conscious of the difference between her expertise and her identity. When David challenged one of her analyses, Elena felt a familiar flutter of defensive reaction, but was able to observe it without being controlled by it. The challenge became information about how to better serve his needs rather than a threat to her professional competence. Elena, David said as they concluded their session, this has been the most useful strategic conversation I've had in years. Not because you gave me easy answers, but because you helped me ask better questions. After David left, Elena opened a small notebook Dr. Whitmore had given her, now filled with 6 months of cognitive observations and insights. Her weekly reviews had revealed patterns she never would have noticed, how her analytical approach shifted depending on her energy levels, how certain client personalities trigger her old projection patterns, how her most creative insights emerged when she could sit with uncertainty rather than rushing toward premature conclusions. Marcus knocked on her door, carrying coffee and wearing the expression of someone with interesting news to share. "How did the Anderson meeting go?" he asked, settling into the chair David had vacated. Differently than it would have 6 months ago. Instead of trying to give him the right answer to his original question, I helped him discover that he was asking the wrong question entirely. Marcus nodded approvingly. Their partnership had evolved significantly since Elena's return from Thornfield. Instead of their old dynamic of competitive expertise, they developed a collaborative approach that leveraged their different cognitive strengths while remaining conscious of their respective blind spots. Speaking of different approaches, Marcus said, I just got off a call with the Thornfield Alumni Network. Sarah wants to discuss a joint presentation proposal for the International Consulting Conference. Something about conscious decision-making in complex organizations. Elena felt a surge of excitement. The monthly calls with her Thornfield cohort had become one of the most valuable aspects of her professional development. They created a space for examining their thinking patterns without professional consequences, challenging each other's assumptions with curiosity rather than competition. Sarah had integrated conscious thinking into her medical practice with remarkable results. Her diagnostic accuracy had actually improved as she'd learned to balance systematic analysis with pattern recognition. Andreas was pioneering what he called collaborative innovation, working with established companies to find creative solutions that honored both their existing capabilities and their growth aspirations. Rachel had developed quantitative models that explicitly incorporated their own limitations and uncertainty ranges. I'd love to collaborate on that presentation, Elena said, though I suspect we should practice what we preach and examine our own assumptions about what conference attendees actually need. Marcus laughed. You know, that's exactly the kind of response that would have annoyed me 6 months ago. I would have thought you were overcomplicating things. Now I recognize it as intellectual thoroughness. Their conversation was interrupted by Elena's assistant announcing a video call from an unexpected source. Ingmar Nordstrom, the client whose dissatisfaction had triggered Elena's original crisis of confidence. Elena accepted the call with genuine curiosity rather than defensive apprehension. Nordstrom appeared on her screen, looking more relaxed than she remembered, surrounded by what appeared to be a busy pharmaceutical manufacturing facility. Elena, I hope you don't mind the unexpected call. I've been following Meridian's recent client communications, and I'm intrigued by this shift toward what you're calling conscious consulting. I wonder if we might explore working together again. Elena felt a complex mix of emotions, vindication, caution, genuine interest, and found herself able to hold all of them simultaneously without being controlled by any of them. I'd be open to exploring that Ingmar, though I want to start by understanding what you've learned about your needs since our previous engagement, and what I've learned about my approach since then. That's exactly the kind of honesty I was hoping for. Too many consultants pretend their previous work was perfect rather than acknowledging what they've learned from experience. The conversation that followed exemplified Elena's evolved approach to client relationships. Instead of defending her previous analysis or attacking Nordstrom's criticism, she treated their failed engagement as valuable data about the gap between what clients said they wanted and what they actually needed. Instead of promising certain outcomes, she described her process for navigating uncertainty while maintaining forward momentum. By the end of the call, they'd agreed to a small pilot project that would allow both parties to test their evolved approaches to strategic collaboration. After ending the call, Elena sat back in her chair and reflected on how differently the conversation had felt. 6 months ago, Nordstrom's initial criticism had triggered a crisis of professional identity. Today, his return felt like an opportunity to practice conscious expertise in service of genuine problem-solving. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Whitmore. "How goes the practice of conscious thinking in the wild?" Elena smiled and typed back. "More challenging and more rewarding than I expected. The real learning happens not in moments of insight, but in daily applications under pressure." His reply came quickly. "The deepest practice is when conscious thinking becomes unconsciously natural, when questioning assumptions becomes as automatic as breathing." Elena found herself considering this paradox, how the ultimate goal of conscious thinking might be to develop unconscious habits that supported rather than replace conscious choice, like learning to drive. At first, every action required deliberate attention, but eventually the mechanical aspects became automatic, freeing attention for higher-level navigation and response to unexpected conditions. As the afternoon wore on, Elena found herself in a strategy meeting with Meridian's Nordic partners, discussing the firm's expansion plans. The familiar dynamics were all present: competitive positioning among colleagues, pressure to demonstrate unique value, the temptation to oversell capabilities to win new business. But Elena's engagement felt fundamentally different. When a colleague criticized her approach to market analysis, she found herself genuinely curious about what his criticism revealed rather than automatically defensive. When pressure mounted to promise accelerated timelines, she could feel the familiar pull to sacrifice thoroughness for client satisfaction, but chose to explore creative ways to meet client needs without compromising analytical integrity. Most significantly, when the group faced a complex decision about which markets to prioritize, Elena found herself naturally facilitating the kind of multi-perspective analysis she'd learned at Thornfield. Instead of arguing for her preferred option, she helped the group examine the assumptions underlying each choice, the stakeholder interests each would serve, and the kind of evidence that would help them choose consciously rather than reactively. "Elena," said Astrid Larson at the end of the meeting, "your facilitation approach has evolved significantly. You're helping us think better rather than just thinking for us." Elena felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal recognition and everything to do with contributing to collective problem-solving quality. This was the service orientation Dr. Whitmore had described, using conscious thinking not just for individual advantage, but for the quality of shared decision-making. Walking home through Copenhagen's evening streets, Elena found herself reflecting on how her relationship to uncertainty had transformed. 6 months ago, not knowing it felt like professional weakness. Now it felt like intellectual honesty and the starting point for genuine inquiry. Her phone rang, a call from Rachel, whose voice carried the excited energy of someone who had just experienced a breakthrough. "Elena, I have to tell you about what happened today. I was presenting quarterly performance analysis to our executive committee, and instead of just reporting results, I found myself helping them examine their assumptions about what the data meant and what responses it suggested." "How did they react?" "Initially resistant. They wanted simple answers to complex questions. But when I helped them see how their different interpretations revealed different strategic priorities they hadn't consciously examined, the conversation became incredibly productive. We ended up redesigning our entire approach to performance measurement." Elena smiled, feeling particular satisfaction that came from witnessing someone else's growth. "You helped them think better rather than just thinking for them." "Exactly. And Elena, Here's the thing. It felt more like genuine service than any analysis I've ever provided. Instead of just delivering expert opinions, I was facilitating their own conscious thinking about their challenges. After the call, Elena continued her walk along the harbor, watching the play of light on water and thinking about ripple effects. Each of them was influencing their professional environments toward more conscious decision-making, which influenced their colleagues and clients, which gradually shifted organizational cultures toward greater intellectual honesty and collaborative problem-solving. The transformation they'd experienced at Thornfield was multiplying through their networks, creating small pockets of conscious thinking that might eventually contribute to broader cultural change. At home that evening, Elena opened her journal for her weekly cognitive review. 6 months of practicing conscious thinking in professional context has taught me that the real work isn't maintaining perfect awareness. It's developing the habit of returning to awareness when I notice I've slipped into automatic patterns. The most surprising discovery is how much more creative and effective I've become, not despite acknowledging uncertainty and limitations, but because of that acknowledgement. When I'm not defending a false certainty, I'm free to explore genuinely novel solutions. But the deeper satisfaction is relational. When I can engage with clients and colleagues from conscious curiosity rather than defensive expertise, every interaction becomes an opportunity for mutual learning and genuine problem solving. The question I'm living with now: how can I continue developing conscious thinking not just as individual practice, but as contribution to collective intelligence? How can I help create the kind of professional culture I want to work in? Outside her window, Copenhagen sailed into evening, its ancient and modern elements coexisting in a kind of complex harmony that emerged not from central planning, but from countless individual choices guided by shared values and mutual consideration. Elena realized that this was what conscious thinking ultimately served, not individual success or competitive advantage, but the quality of collective human problem-solving in service of challenges too complex for any single mind to master alone. The journey that had begun with a failed client presentation had led not just to personal transformation, but to a deeper understanding of thinking itself as a collaborative practice, a shared responsibility, a gift that multiplied when given freely to others. As she prepared for sleep, Elena felt not the satisfaction of having arrived at a destination, but the excitement of having discovered a direction toward increasingly conscious engagement with the endless human project of learning to think together about problems that matter. The real adventure was just beginning.